City faces a looming 15% budget cut, it is going to be extremely important that we have a clear answer of what the $4.5 billion to $5 billion will be for the $12 billion estimated cost for migrants, which we'll delve into. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank the Contracts Committee, Senior Counsel Alex Polinoff, Policy Analyst Alex Yabalon, and Financial Analyst Florentine Cabor, as well as the Investigative Committee staff, Aaron Mendelson, Nicole Kata, Megan Powers, Zachary Mayer, Kevin Frick, and Katie Sinis from the Council's Oversight and Investigations Division for all their hard work on this hearing. With that said, I would like to acknowledge the Council members that are here today, Councilmember Schulman, Councilmember Holden, and Councilmember Nurse. And now Chair Brewer will deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Wan. I'm Gail Brewer. I'm chair of the Council Committee on Oversight and Investigations. I too want to welcome my colleagues, the administration, advocates, and everyone to today's hearing on city contracts serving the growing number of asylum seekers in our city. Obviously, one of New York's proudest legacies is serving as a beacon of hope and a symbol of opportunity to people around the globe. We have always welcomed newcomers, and we always will. But we know we are strained in our capacity to meet the needs of the current influx of more than 100,000 asylum seekers. We are fortunate to have numerous young families with children. They are people deeply traumatized by experiences in their countries of origin and along the way to the United States. And adults who are prohibited by federal immigration law from working without a permit, although I understand thanks to many individuals that might change in terms of the Venezuelans. To provide asylum seekers with housing, food, and services ranging from counseling to legal help, the city has turned to an array of outside contractors, for-profit and nonprofits. These firms have quickly gotten huge payouts under looser emergency contracting procedures to stand up an entire ecosystem of facilities and services. However, we keep hearing disturbing reports in the news from our constituents and from oversight officials like the controller and the IBO that suggest some of these contractors are abusing the city's trust. We've heard allegations of sexual harassment in shelters. I know that some of the oversight of security guards has been lax because they've been getting high on the job. And numerous individuals on contractors' payrolls who don't seem to have enough to do. We are very concerned about the CEO of DocGo. It's a firm that got a nearly $500 million no-bid contract to provide various services to asylum seekers. Despite having no such experience, they're focused on healthcare primarily. And the CEO was forced to resign after he fabricated his credentials. I have no problem not having a college degree, but just be honest about it. Simultaneously, Controller Brad Lander found numerous troubling issues with the contract itself. He'll be testifying later, and it only continues against his recommendation. We understand that in emergencies, sometimes being expeditious takes precedence over dotting every T and crossing every I, dotting every I and crossing every T, but not when public money is at stake, in my opinion. At a time when administration has called for stark budget cuts across agencies to pay for such massive contracts, we really want to understand whether these sacrifices are demanded in good faith. Why has the administration given such enormous contracts to firms with the experience that is not relevant to the job? And of course, you really can't lie about your credentials. What safeguards are in place to make sure contractors actually deliver quality services? What's the oversight? And with this stream of new arrivals showing no signs of stopping, at what point do we stop treating this as a temporary emergency and contracting under looser emergency rules? I just want to say, I know that there is always a lot of attempted oversight, but just this week going into one of the SRO shelters in my district with migrants, we found out that for 2 months, there were no diapers, no wipes, and no baby formula. And after we brought it to the attention of the city, they're getting them today. But that's not good oversight. I too want to thank the Oversight and Investigation staff, Legislative Counsel Nicole Catal, Policy Analyst Alexia Blond, and O&I staff, Director Aaron Mendelson, Deputy Director Powers, Counsel Kevin Frick, Lead Investigator Zach Mayer, and Investigator Carrie Sinise, and on my staff, Sam Goldsmith. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Madam Chair. Who's swearing in?
Senior Counsel Alex Polinoff. Will all members of the administration please raise your right hands? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony today, and to respond honestly to council member questions? Thank you. You may begin when ready.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the City Council's Committee on Contracts, the Committee on Oversight and Investigations, Chair Wan, Chair Brewer, and the committee members for organizing today's hearing on city contracts serving asylum seekers. My name is Molly Wasso Park, and I serve as the Commissioner for the Department of Social Services, which is made up of the Human Resources Administration and the Department of Homeless Services. I am pleased to join my colleagues, Commissioner of New York City Emergency Management Zach Iskel, Chief of Staff and Deputy Commissioner for External Affairs of the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, George Sarkissian, and Senior Vice President, Ambulatory Care and Population Health, New York City Health and Hospitals, Dr. Theodore Long. The New York City Department of Social Services is the nation's largest social services agency. Each year, we assist more than 3 million New Yorkers advancing a mission of fighting poverty and income inequality. I appreciate the opportunity to review with you one critical aspect of our work, which is contracting with vendors and providers. Contracts allow us to mobilize the resources in our communities to deliver services and support to asylum seekers. The contracting process is governed by a myriad of laws, regulations, and executive orders from the federal, state, and local levels. While we will only have the opportunity to review parts of a larger contracting process that spans volumes, I want to assure you that we are mindful of the meaningful difference the supports we provide make in the New Yorkers' lives. We bring that sense of responsibility to each part of the contracting process. Amongst its purposes, the Procurement Policy Board rules direct us to provide for increased public confidence in New York City's public procurement processes, ensure the fair and equitable treatment of all persons who deal with the procurement system of the City of New York, provide for increased efficiency, economy, and flexibility in city purchasing activities and to maximize to the fullest extent the purchasing power of the city, foster effective open competition to the extent possible from all segments of the vendor community, including small businesses and minority and women-owned and operated enterprises, safeguard the integrity of the procurement system and protect against corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse, ensure appropriate public access to contracting information, and foster equal employment opportunities in the policies and practices of contractors and subcontractors wishing to do business with the city. Our team of contracting officers and procurement professionals work to make those directives a reality. In August of 2022, we issued the emergency solicitation for the DHS City sanctuary facilities, the document requesting proposals to serve the emergency needs of asylum seekers. In that solicitation, we sought vendors to procure and operate sites to serve families with children, adult families, or single adults. This is an open-ended solicitation, meaning proposals are reviewed on an ongoing basis, and we began accepting proposals immediately. The solicitation is still open, and we are still receiving proposals. Note that this solicitation is by no means constitutes the totality of our response at DSS or our response as a city, which has included all the tools in our procurement toolbox. However, it does provide an important window into our approach to emergency procurement. This emergency solicitation was issued pursuant to our declaration of emergency for asylee services and shelter, an emergency procurement declaration to rapidly procure shelter and other services for people seeking asylum in New York City. Comptroller Lander then worked closely with the administration to appropriately expedite contracts and ensure New York City can deliver shelter and services that families seeking asylum here urgently need. The emergency declaration sets forth the framework we operate under given the urgent needs we face. After issuing the solicitation in August 2022, we held an information session to answer questions from interested providers. Subsequently, both new and existing providers have submitted proposals to operate emergency facilities. Proposals are reviewed by at least 3 raters who assess proposals along multiple metrics, including experience, organizational capacity, and approach. After assessing the scores in that rating process, we decline proposals below a certain threshold. Where possible, we offer constructive feedback to those proposals we decline. For proposals above the rating threshold, the city enters into contract negotiations, which simultaneously confirm whether the proposer has the capacity to enter into a provider agreement. The process includes negotiating a budget and outlining parameters on city requirements for staffing and services. We undertake these negotiations with a model budget we use as a guidepost to ensure the city receives appropriate value per contract. In analyzing negotiation outcomes, however, it is important to keep in mind that in an emergency context, some costs are more expensive relative to non-emergency procurement, where we have months of lead time for planning and scoping. Even given the emergency context, these methodical steps exemplify the thoughtfulness and care with which we proceed in emergency procurement. There are many further aspects to contracting in general and emergency procurement in particular that are not easily summarized, from the activation of existing contracts to deliver services, to the ongoing assessment and evaluation of contract performance, to the checks and balances provided by the Law Department, Office of Management and Budget, Office of the Comptroller, and the City Council. More than 116,000 asylum seekers have come through New York City's intake system since the spring of 2022. We have over 60,400 asylum seekers currently in the city's care. The city has opened 210 sites, including 17 large-scale humanitarian relief centers. As New Yorkers, we mobilized. Community-based organizations, houses of worship, volunteers, and public servants have all participated in answering the call to feed, clothe, and house asylum seekers in our city. Human service providers stepped up, bringing to bear their considerable experience in delivering care for New Yorkers. Our human service partners continue to help us care for our communities of new New Yorkers. As city leaders, we utilized every tool in our toolbox to help meet moral obligations, including emergency contracting and procurement. Using these tools, we at DSS and DHS opened emergency shelters in all 5 boroughs, serving families with children, single adults, and adult families. The city continues to receive thousands of new arrivals a week seeking shelter and support, and we have worked tirelessly to live up to our obligation to provide help. I would like to take a moment to recognize the truly amazing work of colleagues at DSS, at our sister agencies, and across the broad network of providers and not-for-profit partners engaged in meeting these challenges on a daily basis. The care and compassion that have guided our response thus far will continue to carry us through our response to these unprecedented circumstances. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague from HPD to give his testimony.
Thank you, Commissioner Park. Good afternoon, Chair Brewer, Chair Wan, and members of the Committee on Oversight and Investigations and Committee on Contracts. My name is George Sarkissian. I'm the Chief of Staff and Deputy Commissioner for External Affairs at the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and discuss HPD's work serving asylum seekers. For almost a year, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development has joined the multi-agency effort to shelter and care for thousands of asylum seekers arriving in New York City every week. As the number of new arrivals increased since April 2022, the city's response grew proportionately. Joining the Department of Social Services, New York City Health and Hospitals, and New York City Emergency Management, as well as several other agencies that provide support services, HPD has worked hard to meet the challenge head-on. As an agency that already provides shelter to New Yorkers displaced from their homes because of fires and other emergencies, HPD has core competencies we've built upon. As many of you know, when a fire leads to a vacate order of a residential building for unlivable conditions, the American Red Cross, contracted by HPD, provides immediate short-term shelter in nearby hotels. Households that need longer-term shelter as they wait for their homes to be repaired then are moved into HPD's emergency shelter system. In addition to our existing emergency services staff, we've pulled in staff from various parts of our agency, including budget, legal, and the Commissioner's Office, all doing double duty, addressing the housing crisis in New York City and the needs of asylum seekers arriving in New York City. The same values that drive us to help the most vulnerable New Yorkers find affordable and safe housing drive us to help asylum seekers who are looking for shelter and stability. In an environment of limited resources, we all must work harder to meet the needs of the people we serve. This is true of all the agencies and partners sitting here with me today, and so many more. In total, our city has spent $2.08 billion through the end of August 2023 on asylum seekers. Our city agencies have budgeted $2.9 billion for fiscal year 24 and have spent $637 million in July and August to serve asylum seekers, providing shelter, meals, and support services to the migrants seeking safety and their own American dream. To give an overview of HPD's involvement in the crisis, currently HPD is serving approximately 5,000 asylum seekers in our shelters. Today, we have over 2,300 individuals in our downstate hotels, 1,900 individuals in our upstate hotels, and will soon have approximately 1,600 men in our humanitarian emergency response and relief centers, also known as HERCs, and houses of worship sites in New York City. Last fiscal year, HPD spent approximately $33 million on asylum seeker initiatives, and for the current fiscal year to date, we have already incurred about $80 million in expenses through the end of August. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to discuss our different locations and services our agency has been able to provide asylum seekers. HPD's first shelter serving asylum seekers opened this past spring in Bushwick, Brooklyn. The Jefferson, a HERC that is currently serving approximately 532 asylum seekers, is a commercial building which has been converted into a congregate shelter. We are grateful for the Department of Design and Construction for managing the design and construction needed to convert the building into a shelter, and grateful to H&H for helping train our staff on how to stand up and manage operations. We have built a partnership with the local community in Bushwick and are particularly grateful to Councilmember Jennifer Gutierrez for her leadership and her genuine efforts to assist our asylum seekers. On June 5th, the mayor announced a partnership with faith leaders to launch a faith-based shelter program. This is another opportunity for HPD to support the city and the asylum seekers who are coming here. Partnering with the New York Disaster Interfaith Service, also known as NIDIS, the program makes houses of worship available to asylum seekers for shelter. Faith-based organizations across the city have stepped up to respond to the needs of asylum seekers, many of them serving the material needs directly, but many of them also offering space for congregate shelter. Partnering with the Department of Buildings and the FDNY, HPD and NIDIS have been working with houses of worship to ensure available space is made safe for asylum seekers. Our first two houses of worship opened in September, the Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church and Christ Disciples, both in the Bronx. We have several other interested houses of worship that we are currently working with plans to provide shelter for asylum seekers through the NIDIS program. In addition to our shelters in New York City, HPD operates shelters in various locations throughout New York State. Due to the overwhelming need and short supply of space, something we see in the housing crisis more generally, the city decided to open up shelters upstate as part of our ongoing decompression strategy. As hotels have filled up in New York City and costs for hotel rooms continue to increase because of limited supply, we decided to alleviate some of this pressure by transporting asylum seekers that volunteered to leave the city for upstate hotels. HPD contracted with .go to operate upstate shelters, and services provided in our upstate shelters are the same as those provided here in our HERCs, which include shelter, food, laundry services, access to case management, and social work. As we began to open sites in spring 2023, it became clear that several counties, cities, and towns would not welcome our asylum seekers. Xenophobic rhetoric from some elected officials, combined with emergency declarations and temporary restraining orders prohibiting the city from using local hotels, have been challenging. However, working with city partners in government affairs and outreach, we continue to engage local communities in places like Albany County, Erie County, where Buffalo is located, Monroe County, where Rochester is located. We've developed meaningful partnerships with county executives, city mayors, school districts, and local CBOs to ensure our asylum seekers have an opportunity to integrate into local communities. Our partnerships with these local officials and CBOs are ongoing, including regular meetings to coordinate operations and work out any issues that arise together. .go is currently operating 13 hotels upstate and 15 hotels here in New York City for HPD. Whenever possible, DOTGO has subcontracted with local CBOs to provide case management services, as they know their communities best and are able to make referrals as needed. DOTGO has also worked to identify local vendors for all the other services, including food, laundry, and security. Over the past several months, as we've expanded our hotel shelter system, HPD has been required to respond quickly and to the needs of the families arriving at the arrival center. Every day, hundreds of new asylum seekers arrive here, which requires the city to quickly mobilize and add capacity when it becomes critically short. In these moments, standing up operations safely at a new hotel is always the first priority to ensure our newest New Yorkers are not sleeping on our streets. That has been the focus of our work and our contract with DOTGO. But as our shelter system quickly increased in size and geography, it is also vital to focus our energy and capacity on operations and oversight of our upstate hotels and the needs of the asylum seekers in our care. We have a network of partners we've relied upon and worked with closely to provide additional visibility into the operations of our upstate hotels, in addition to our contracting oversight. The New York Immigration Coalition and their network has developed a relationship with most of our upstate hotels and the asylum seekers in our care. They have been a key partner in all our upstate locations, especially in communities where we've experienced some of the xenophobia. And their network partners have helped us make sure our asylum seekers are welcomed with love and compassion. In addition to the New York Immigration Coalition, the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance and the New York Legal Aid Society have visited our upstate and downstate hotels operated by DOTGO and have provided helpful feedback that we've used to improve operations. It's important to note that both OTDA and Legal Aid have provided mostly positive reports about the operations of our upstate hotels. We appreciate their constructive feedback and know we can always do better. We also recognize that the speed and scope of this work, as we stand up new sites, will require constant learning and responding to new challenges. We take this incredibly seriously. HPD has been responsive to reports regarding subcontractors in our upstate hotels and have also been working closely with DOTGO to ensure subcontractors are performing well. For example, when we received complaints that the food in our Albany hotels was not culturally appropriate, DOTGO selected several new potential vendors and allowed asylum seekers to sample the food before choosing a new vendor. HPD recently opened our second HERC on Austell Place in Long Island City. With a capacity of almost 900 adults, Austell Place is an office building that was converted into congregate shelter that opened earlier this month. DOTGO was selected as a vendor to operate the shelter. I want to thank Chair Wan for her interest in Austell Place and the welfare of asylum seekers in our care. Moving forward, HPD and our colleagues at NYSEM, H&H, and DHS will continue to work hard to serve the asylum seekers in our care. We're always looking for opportunities to improve and move towards a steady state of operations. HPD has a new team with dedicated staff to serve asylum seekers. This new unit will allow HPD to focus on adding shelter capacity and give us greater visibility into our shelter operations. We thank the City Council for the opportunity to testify and are grateful for your continued commitment to support and care the growing migrant population and look forward to working together on this whole society effort. We're here to answer any questions you may have.
I would like to acknowledge Councilmember Yeager, Councilmember Vernikoff, Councilmember Joseph, Councilmember Lee, Councilmember Williams, and Councilmember Hanif for joining us. And before we start our questioning, I would like to acknowledge that, as you may know, we have invited 7 executives of companies with key city contracts involving asylum seekers to testify today at the council hearing, and not a single one of them have chosen to appear. In fact, we understand that the administration directed them to not appear, and this is a violation of what the charter states. In Section 29 of the city charter, it grants the power of investigation and oversight to the council, which may investigate any matters within its jurisdiction relating to the property affairs or government of the city or in any county within the city, as well as any standing or special committee shall have the power to require the attendance and examine and take testimony under oath of such persons that it deems necessary to require the production of books, accounts, papers, and other evidence related to the inquiry, as well as Section 30 of the Charter, which allows us to investigate. It gives us the authority to review and investigate contractual spending by city agencies. I'm going to name the ones that were invited that have chosen not to appear. Anthony Capone of DocGo, the former CEO, and since DocGo's resignation due to fraudulent fabrication of his resume, we've also invited Aaron Weiner, the Chief Information Officer of DocGo, to testify, and the total value of DocGo's contract with the city is $432 million. Second, we invited William Sullivan of SLS Co. The total value of SLS Co.'s contract within the city is $135 million. Third, we invited AJ Caro of Aero Security, which has been under a lot of scrutiny, as you heard from Councilmember Brewer. The total value of Aero Security's contract with the city is $140 million. Fourth, we invited Martin Kukier of Executive Medical Services. The total value of Executive Medical Services contract with the city is $219 million. Fifth, we invited Vijay Dapnani of Hanek Foundation. The total value of Hanek's contractual agreement with the city is $237 million, and now totaling with its renewal for 2026, over $1 billion. Lastly, we also invited Matt Jozowak of Rethink Foods New York City. The total value of Rethink Foods' contract with the city is $87,800,000. Had any of them appeared, we would have asked them the following questions, among others. First, we would have asked them how did they procure their asylum-seeking contracts with the city? Was there a bidding process for their contracts? How is the total value? What is the total value of their contracts? And how do they justify it? How much has been paid to date? How much are they still owed to the city? Still by the city? And have there been any complaints or other issues related to their performance of their contracts? How, if at all, have they addressed these issues and others? But because, however, not a single one of them have appeared to testify, these 7 executives had the courage and did not have the courage and respect to the city council as well as the people of New York City to testify before us today, and we were unable to ask these questions. We'll leave it to the administration, the press, and the public to continue to ask these questions about these companies and these vendors about their contracts with the city in order to ensure that our city is spending its money wisely with reputable companies and with its best interests of the people in New York City, with the 115,000 asylum seekers who are seeking to serve, that we are seeking to serve and protect. We will begin our questioning for the administration. I also want to acknowledge Councilmember Salamanca as well as Councilmember Gennaro for joining us as well. On June 29, 2022, Mayor Adams declared the need for emergency procurement under Section 315 of the New York City Charter and Section 306 of the Procurement Policy Board rules to address the migrant crisis. Now, 18 months later, it's been over a year. Why is the regular arrival of asylum seekers to New York City still deemed an unforeseen occurrence qualifying for emergency procurement, where we just heard our Deputy Commissioner of HPD state how the hotels have filled up? There is clearly a predictable cost now where we can see the trends in the data from the last 18 months to understand that it is no longer unforeseeable, but they are seeable.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'll start. My colleagues should certainly chime in. This has been an immensely challenging 18 months for the administration. We have seen essentially a doubling of the number of people experiencing homelessness in the city. So, a trend that grew up over 40 years, we've doubled it in 18 months. It has actually been, we've seen multiple waves, so, peaks and then incoming slowed down, it's gone back up. So there has been a lot of unpredictability. What I can say is that within the Department of Homeless Services, when we do a standard shelter, it is typically a year to 2 years from the point at which we identify a site until that site is ready to open. There's very few buildings that are off-the-shelf homeless shelters, right? So we're doing construction, we're doing other kinds of work. The hotels that we're using now are because they are suitable for residential purposes in very short periods of time. So I would say we are looking at ways that we can both accommodate the influx of people that are coming in and while also transitioning to longer-term operations, but understanding that it isn't, given the nature of the procurement process, the nature of construction in the city, it is something that will take time.
With housing, rent, and other initial outfitting, as you mentioned, being the majority of the actual spending type for asylum seekers' response, if hotels are filled up and we know that we will continue to renew these hotel contracts, is it still unforeseeable for you?
So DHS is in the process of renewing a number of its emergency contracts, and I do want to emphasize our sites were all procured competitively, right? We did have an RFP. We put out and went through a fairly standard competition process to identify providers, to identify sites. We are renewing those sites at this point, we're doing 3-year contracts on the assumption that it will take us some time to transition to alternative locations, to alternative structures. The goal is not to continue to use hotels for long term. Hotels have been a part of the DHS response to homelessness on and off for many years now. We've been very public about the fact that, particularly for families with children, we don't think hotels are the right response. We were very pleased at the end of calendar year 21, we had gotten all the families with children out of hotels and at that, very shortly after, we saw this influx of asylum seekers starting, and we needed to revisit hotels. But we recognize that it is not the long-term plan, and we are working on strategies to transition to alternative forms of shelter.
So in your view, when is it no longer an unforeseeable occurrence for emergency procurement?
We are managing through the steady increase of, well, I shouldn't say steady, actually, fluctuating increase in population. We need to continue to respond in real time. At the same time, we are doubling down and planning for long-term strategies, but those long-term strategies won't be in place overnight.
If I may, do you mind if I just add to that? I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here by the council in terms of what we're doing with contracting. So, Charles, what do we have? Like about 200 contracts that we're leveraging overall? So we have about 200 contracts that we're using for this process.
When you say we, you're talking about your agency?
I'm talking about the city.
The city.
The folks represented up here. My agency, we have about 17, 18 contracts total. The vast majority of those contracts are not emergency contracts. I think we need to be clear about that. Most of the contracts that we are leveraging are competitively bid contracts, things that were put out for RFP, things that are requirements contracts. And a lot of the times what we are doing now is displacing some of the emergency contracts because we have been in for this for so long. So I think the emphasis on what is foreseen and not unforeseen, it's a little bit of, I think, unfair, because this is also an unprecedented emergency in which it is very hard to predict what the future is going to be, what the needs are going to be. We had to shift our focus pretty significantly back in May with the opening of respite centers. There's continuing to be things that we need to adjust to that require new emergency procurements. But I think it's also important to remember that just because it's an emergency procurement doesn't mean we are not following certain rules, procedures, and regulations to make sure that we are sticking to the letter of the law and the charter and that we're doing things right. It is just simply a faster process. Some of the things that we're talking about, for example, like if we were looking at a human services RFP, I mean, Molly, what would that take? 18 months, 2 years?
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the emergency process, it's not like we're just showing up with a bag of cash and handing it to somebody. There are still procedures that are being followed to make sure that we have a competitive process, to make sure that we are managing the vendors appropriately, and we're happy to talk more about what that process is that's outlined in the charter.
We definitely want to talk more about it in this hearing because according to the Oversight and Investigation Committee's examination, 196 contracts that were examined for asylum seeker spending, only 3 were procured through competitive bidding. So it seems like we have very contradictory data on how the competitive bidding has been taking place for the asylum seekers. My next question is, what is the actual plan for the mayoral administration for transitioning to non-emergency procurement, and what is your timeline?
I'm sorry, I think, do you want to clarify that? Sure. Yeah, I think you're misunderstanding the definition of some of the contracts with that. But I'll turn it over to Charles.
Thank you, council members. Just to be clear, when we're talking about competitiveness, as the commissioner was just saying, emergency contracts are different on their competition depending on the circumstances. So the rules require that agencies use as much competition as is possible and practicable. So as Commissioner Park was just describing, for their scaling up of their shelter services, they used essentially a very, very similar selection evaluation process as they would for their standard sheltered services. That didn't change, is my understanding. Whereas in another contract, in another instance where, again, in HPD's normal emergency portfolio, a wall falls down and you need to react that night, the selection process is very different. So there is, I would say, emergency contracts are not inherently non-competitive or competitive. They use as much competition as is possible and practical in the circumstances, and it will depend on each contract that, of course, operating agencies can speak to more.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between a competitive sale process and the
I can chime in on that while they're strategizing. More than half of the emergency contracts that were referenced are DHS contracts. We did an RFP. Each of those, so for every single one of those contracts, somebody submitted a proposal. We had a committee of reviewers looking at it. We assessed the viability of the proposal of the contracting organization. We negotiated a budget. So the emergency process allowed us to move more quickly, but we went through a full competitive process.
Commissioner Park, who are your 3 raters who assess emergency proposals? And
It's staff across the agency, and it's going to be different people for each proposal. It would be an overwhelming volume of work to put on 3 individuals.
Okay. How's your determination? I don't think the answer was actually given for my last question for the long-term plan for transitioning to non-emergency procurement.
So I think given the nature, as we've been discussing, that emergency procurement is under, depending on which contract that we're talking about, in some cases it was about getting to registration, getting to the place where we could pay more quickly. In other cases, it was really about vendor selection. In the DHS context, for example, where we did do a full competitive procurement and selection process, we are now thinking about what the terms of those contracts should be. We are pivoting to slightly longer term contracts so that we can get to a more structured place than we have been. In other cases, again, as my colleagues have mentioned, and they can speak to in more detail, we're actually doing new procurements to replace some of those emergencies. But Dr. Long, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate the question. So the way that we're looking at continued operations at our HERC sites is we're looking at each service and lining them up individually. For each of them, or actually for many of them, but not all of them, we needed to have emergency speed to manage the scale of the number of people coming into New York City. But for some, for example, for laundry and security services at our HERCs, we're actually able to leverage contracts that have been put out to RFP through New York City Health and Hospitals for providing the same services in the hospitals. Then when the scale surpassed what those contracts were able to manage, we either extended them or we went to emergency procurement for additional contracts, just given that the capacity that we had with those vendors wasn't enough to meet the need of asylum seekers coming in. For other ones, like medical services, intake, and food, we didn't have any natural contracts to build off of, so for those we went to an emergency procurement at H&H. But we've already, since doing that work, when we had to when there was an emergency level speed and we had to use emergency procurement in order to meet the scale and the demand of people coming in, we've put out 3 RFPs so far. 2 have closed, 1 is currently open. That's for project management, food, and security. So as we transition, agreeing with your point, Councilmember Wan, we are using this as an opportunity, looking ahead to have a competitive process to select the right vendors moving forward. Councilmember.
But how do we explain to the public, according to the media, that on the laundry for DHS it's 99 cents a pound, but for the contract that you have, it's $3 a pound? How do we explain that to the public?
I'm not sure the contracts that we have at our HERCs are $3 a pound. Maybe what I can speak to is to use some specific examples. Initially, when we opened HERCs for laundry, we used Sodexo. because that's the same service that does laundry for my patients in the hospital.
Right.
We can get back to you about the numbers for Sodexo.
That's the one that's $3 a pound.
Sodexo as well. I can actually try to Go ahead.
Right.
I read the article. The $3 a pound is a Garner contract. That's a citywide requirements contract. The $3 is based off of the federal GSA schedule is where that pricing comes from. I also want to be clear, just because it says $3 per pound, it doesn't mean you're actually paying for $3 per pound. It could mean you're paying up to $3 per pound. But the Garner contract was not an emergency procurement. That is a citywide requirements contract that was competitively bid ahead of this emergency for times of emergency. So I think one of the problems that we're dealing with, Council Member, is that there is a lot of conflation going on by members of the press and, dare I say, members of the City Council in terms of what are emergency contracts and what are not. I think it's also important just to outline that in an emergency contract process, right, we're still obtaining prior approval from the Law Department and the Comptroller. We're still going through a robust vendor selection process. We're still getting final approval from those affirmation parties. We're still filing with the Comptroller. They've been incredibly helpful throughout this process. And then we're still doing the notifications to the council and implementation of the city record.
I understand that. But one of the problems is transparency is not extremely evident, maybe more for the city than, with all due respect to health and hospitals, because you're not a city agency. So one of the reasons when you say it's conflated by the press and the city council is because it is really hard to get this information. Sometimes materials redacted when you try to get the contracts. And I have to also say, just by not enabling the contractors to be here, you didn't call, but intergovernmental called to tell certain people not to show up from the mayor's office. We have fact here. So, I mean, we all need to be transparent. And then maybe people would understand up to 3 as opposed to 99 cents per pound. It's not transparent.
I'm sorry, the only point I was making with that is that the Garner contract specifically is not an emergency procurement. The Garner contract was a competitively bid citywide requirements contract.
I understand that, but then you have
that was called an emergency contract in the press today. It is not an emergency contract. It was competitively bid.
But then we have to understand, why is it 99 cents in else, and why is it $3 here?
And can I just add one point, Councilmember Brewer? Just to agree with you about the need for transparency, that's why we've put out the 3 RFPs that we have through H&H. Our RFP process for New York City Health and Hospitals is public. We lay out the process itself, how it works, how diligence works. That's all. Those policies that we have are all public. So we're applying those same public policies and procedures, which are how we govern our hospitals as well, to the services that I outlined, including we haven't yet done laundry, but we intend to.
To that point, going back to Mr. Diamond, could you help me understand? Commissioner Park just said that it normally takes 18 months to register contracts through traditional bidding, but you all are able to do this much quicker. So what is being missed or omitted during emergency review that allows you to go so much faster then, since you're still saying that it is competitive?
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember. So in particular to Commissioner Park's example, I believe that was for a human services shelter RFP, which again is specific to the issue at hand, but also is a contract that takes a particularly long amount of time. Now, the various things that are going to be in there, I would give there are certainly things that are excluded from the process, such as a public hearing. It does not occur in an emergency contract. There are going to be exclusions. However, I think as Commissioner Park very accurately described, the evaluation, the pool that they're addressing and then they're evaluating from, they're building from their existing scale and then trying to scale that up through an emergency procurement. So I'll defer to Commissioner Park about specific to the shelter. However, in terms of the length of a process, it really is that 2-step that we described, that the Commissioner described. Prior approval and final approval. Some would say that that's more rigorous, requires more insight. It is different, but it does require both prior approval, final approval, filing, and has its own inbuilt checks and balances from the charter. And I'll defer to Commissioner Park if she had anything else to add.
Yeah, I think there's,
Yeah, and specifically it is the prior approval of the controller and the law department, and then the final approval of the controller and the law department, to be clear. Yeah.
There's in a standard process, there's built-in specific lengths of time that people have for response, for review, for and all the many different oversights. So people are moving more quickly. That includes my staff moving more quickly. It includes the vendors moving more quickly for reviewing. But just importantly, as was said, when there are pre-approvals for the concept of the procurement, that we are able to move much more quickly.
And can I-
I'm sorry. Very quickly, Councilmember, if I may. Also, much of this process does still occur. An important point is an emergency contract allows an agency and a contract to be effective earlier in the process. So although some of the process is occurring, it allows work to start earlier in the procurement process. It changes the timing slightly. So I would also note that it's really as well as about allowing the work to occur early, while allowing those checks and balances to play out. I'm sorry, Dr. Long.
I was just going to add, Councilmember Brewer, in favor of transparency, and we are here to be as transparent as possible. I want to answer a specific question. So Sodexo, which is the predominant vendor that we still use for laundry services at the HERCs, was procured through a competitive RFP, again, for our hospitals, for my patients in the hospital. And the price per pound that we pay Sodexo is at or below 99 cents per pound, which you referenced. Just to make the point that we agree with transparency and we agree with having a competitive process, because that's what was used to achieve the Sodexo price point that we have right now that we've been able to leverage through New York City Health and Hospitals. It was competitively put through the RFP process.
We are a little baffled here by what you're saying, because what's going on with our MWBEs? Are you fast tracking through MWBEs or small businesses? And we also have found in both of our districts, amongst the entire city council as well, for nonprofit providers as well as in other districts, we've seen that even if they're given the contract, especially for DHS, more than half of my shelters, which I have over 30 of in my district, they remain empty and are only staffed by National Guard because the nonprofit providers haven't received their advance payment or were not able to bring themselves up to capacity. So you tell me that it's moving faster, but in some cases it's not either. And I want to understand. We have other questions and we're going to move on, but we'll dive into MWB questioning later. The last question that I have for every single agency that is present today is, how are emergency vendors selected? How are they found? And what is the vetting conducted for emergency vendors, especially with the current scenario with DocGo? The public has a lot of questions about how you are selecting your vendors.
I can start generally and then turn to the agencies if that would work. So in terms of for the selecting a vendor in an emergency procurement, and as Commissioner Eskel said very clearly, there's a lot of different types of procurements that we're doing. Just to let them, RFPs, bids, the use of P cards, MWBE, non-competitive small purchases, traditional small purchases. But if we're talking about just the emergency procurement method, the key phrase that we used earlier is as much competition as is possible and practicable. So it will differ for those different agencies. In terms of their integrity and going through that process, the standard is the same. Every single contractor that the city contracts with must be found responsible by their agency for the receipt of public funds. That standard exists in emergency procurements as in standard procurements. So the competition aspect, they can dive into how it is contract or contract and case-by-case basis, but those are the general aspects.
So for competition as possible and practical, how is that reported and shared with the public?
In terms of how, in terms of how that competition is then done, that is included not only in the final approval to the controller and to the law department. That's exactly where you say, how did I use this approval you gave me? That's also included in the notice to the city council. So the city council, I know in the case of DocGo and in others, gets a formal notification that indicates, and I think the exact phrasing is usually, how is this vendor selected? So it will describe the amount of competition in every single case. Commissioner, please.
I just want to add one thing to that. If we could just back up, Chairwoman. So we have, before we even start the process of an emergency contract, one of the things that we do is we sort of look and see, do we even need to do an emergency procurement, right? In most cases, there might be a city contract held by another agency. There could be a citywide requirements contract or something else that has gone through a competitive process in the past that we could leverage. We also have leveraged contracts that might be owned by the state in the past, right? Because they have gone through a competitive process. So before we even determine whether we need to do an emergency contract, we make a determination to see if there are existing contracts in place that we could possibly use. That's part of the process. I think the other thing is a lot of this is sometimes contract dependent. So for example, at our respite centers, we set up a laundry service where we provide vouchers to our guests where they can go to a local laundromat facility. So in that process, my team ended up calling around to, I can get you the exact number, but it was a lot of laundromats, but they had to be clearly within walking distance or close to those facilities. The point I'm trying to make is that sometimes in terms of the process of identifying contractors, It varies based on what the actual contract is serving and what the needs are based on that specific case.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of follow up, like Zach said. So for HPD in particular, we had a very unique program we were being asked to stand up, right? And as Charles told you, the amount of competition and the procurement process kind of really depends on the objective and program. So back in the spring of 2023, HPD was asked to stand up a program to essentially decompress the city, right? To relieve some of the pressure we had here. And it's a moment in time when, DHS had stood up dozens and dozens of new shelters in hotels, right? And they essentially maxed out their ability to stand up new shelters and new hotels, and we needed additional hands to do some of that work. And so we, HPD, were brought in to do some of that, right? To identify sites upstate, hotels in upstate communities, to transfer asylum seekers who volunteered to those upstate communities. So it was quite a unique thing we were trying to accomplish there. So we reached out to our sister agencies, both DHS and H&H, to better understand the vendors that they had working for them. So I'm just going to turn it over for a second to Dr. Long, who will talk a little bit about DOCO and the relationship they had, and then he'll turn it back over to me to help you understand how we selected them, if that's okay.
Yeah, so and to answer your specific question, I'll say a couple of words about our emergency procurement procedures at H&H, and then I'll say a few words about DOCO in particular, and then turn back to George. So at H&H, we have a standard operating procedure for emergency procurement, remembering that we are a hospital system, so we run 11 emergency rooms, 5 trauma centers. So the reason we have a standard operating procedure is emergencies are not something that's foreign to us. This is part of our day-to-day operations. We then have applied that our standard operating procedure for the asylum seeker crisis to obtain or procure different services that are needed to meet the need and the scale of the crisis. If we were able to use an existing contract, as Commissioner Iscol was alluding to, that we had ahead of time, like for security or like for laundry, we did that. Then we would max that out, sometimes extend that, but then if the scale was necessitate us going beyond that, that's where we'd apply our standard operating procedure, which we have used many times over many years for an emergency procurement. At the earliest possible time, we would then, as we've done 3 times already, go to an RFP to make sure that the vendors we're using have had every opportunity to have competition introduced into the process. Specific for DOCO, I think as everybody recalls, with New York City Test and Trace, I had the opportunity to lead a lot of the operations for New York City's response to COVID. And one of the things we learned early on is that we needed to bring services around to people where they were. It started with testing, then it bridged to vaccines, then it bridged to, we became the first city in the country to have a mobile test-to-treat fleet. We actually had a specific RFP for that, where you could go get tested and within 20 minutes walk away with Paxlovid, which can save your life. Other cities followed. We were the first. But by definition there, we were trailblazing and going fast. And in some of these opportunities, DOCO became a vendor that we began to use. We then, as we got involved with the asylum seeker crisis, initially used DOCO at Port Authority, where we saw that there was a need for asylum seekers coming in to New York City to have immediate medical care. Some poignant examples which stick with me as a doctor is we had a child with a witness seizure because ICE took his medications away at the border, his anti-epileptics, and we saved his life, brought him to the hospital. That's what we are at New York City Health and Hospitals. But if we hadn't had a medical team there, I don't know what would have happened. We've also had pregnant women that have delivered babies right away. So we saw there was a need there, and then we bridged further. At the Navigation Center, we began to use DOCO to provide other services, including social work, connections to completing the forms and connecting with a warm handoff to DOE to enroll kids in school, which is incredibly important for their mental health. Then beyond that, we at H&H started to use them to provide additional services at our sites. The way to conceptualize our sites and how different vendors provide different services is you can conceptualize our HERCs like a hospital. In a hospital, we provide different services. We have the doctors like me. We have laundry services. We have security services. We have food services. And we had to find the right vendor to meet all of those different service needs. And we, again, expanded what the DOCO vendor in particular was doing to meet those needs. But for other services, we were able to use actually the same vendors that we use at our hospitals. So that's sort of the history, and I'll pass back to...
Dr. Wall, I just want to say one thing. As a longtime city employee, the difference between the hospitals and DOCO is the following. Your hospital employees or H&H employees, and they will be there, thank goodness, for many years with their expertise and their, what I call intellectual property. DocGo is gonna go, they might go to Texas, they might go to Alabama, they're not gonna be here forever. That is, to me, the wrong way, not your fault, but this is what we're doing to approach public service, because they will take that expertise in casework and busing and whatever else they do somewhere else. So for lots of reasons, this contract is too expensive, wrong people doing the services. I like the analogy, we're like a hospital, but we're not, because we don't have long-time employees who will take this information and use it for the rest of their lives to help residents of New York. I really feel strongly about that. Thank you.
So thank you, Councilmember Brewer. Just to finish up though, so when HPD was brought into this, like there was a need to kind of move very quickly, right? Because we needed to kind of relieve some of the pressure in the city. So we had to Charles's point, figure out what's practical given the needs that we have to do. So we reached out to DHS, we reached out to H&H to get a sense of like who are the vendors doing this work in this universe, in this sector that we could potentially tap into to kind of achieve our program objectives, you know. So at the time it was very clear the DHS providers were very tapped out, you know, they were at capacity and couldn't actually help us. We met a couple other folks through the folks at H&H, you know, Garner and DocGo, and we've actually brought on Garner to do the Jefferson work, and we've contracted with them there, and they stood up a HERC there. And we brought on DocGo, and I think as Dr. Long mentioned, DocGo has a specific experience and skill set that was very unique to kind of the upstate program, right? The upstate program was about moving into communities we've never been in. Like we have no footprint there, we have no infrastructure there, but we have hotels there, and we have opportunity there to, you know, advance the decompression strategy down here. So this is what DocGo does, right? They're able to, like, they're qualified in their kind of logistical experience and mobilization, you know? They move into an area, set up operations, hire a bunch of people, and keep it moving, you know? And at the time, this is what was, like, most important, because we really wanted to keep people off the streets, and that's our primary objective.
And if I could chime in, first of all, I just want to clarify to Councilmember Wan's comment about the sites that are operated by DHS versus providers. 89 of our shelters are operated by providers, 58 are operated by a combination of DHS staff and National Guard. The reason why we have the directly operated sites of the National Guard is it's not a contracting issue. It is because the same way it is challenging for anybody to staff up very quickly, it's challenging for the not-for-profits to staff up very quickly. So we are linking a not-for-profit to a given site. We need to open the site on day one, but they can't necessarily staff it on day one in a more typical scenario, right? There is a many-month process between while that site is being constructed, that they would also be preparing to staff up. So we are serving as a bridge, and then as soon as they are able to take over the staffing, they do so. But to answer the specific question that you asked about how we're selecting vendors, we are doing it through an RFP process.
So for the shelters, the hotel shelters that do not need to be stood up, but continue to remain empty in my district with no staff other than National Guard, where someone has committed suicide because there was no services there, when is enough of a time that you've given them for them to staff up? And how long are you going to hold their contracting value hostage where someone else could be a provider on time?
Thank you, Councilmember. Just to clarify, nobody's contract is being held hostage. We are moving all the contracts promptly. The providers are working to staff up, and we have seen very rapid movement among those providers. I'm very grateful for the work that they do. I think the last time I was here, it was a lower percentage of sites that were provider staffed. We see that increase because providers are stepping in and filling that role. I'm certainly not going to comment on the record about any individual's mental health experience, but I would just note that all of these individuals have gone through a great deal of travel and trauma, and I don't want to oversimplify what is going on in any.
So how many months are you going to wait for a nonprofit service provider to staff up until you need to move on to another provider that can have capacity to do it?
These sites have been procured over an extended period of time. We started doing this in April of May, June of 2022. The early sites are all staffed up. More recent sites were procured even just a few months ago, so this is not a static population of sites that are DHS run. We are moving our staff around, but each provider's situation is unique. As George mentioned, we have found that the traditional DHS providers have been at capacity. We've worked with our sister agencies that also work with human service providers to identify additional providers, but we have a really robust group of not-for-profits that have stood up, that are doing tremendous work, and we are working with each and every one of them to get into the shelters.
We are going to send you my district's list of shelters, which is more than 12, that do not have shelter providers on the day that they have opened. We will also send you a citywide list of shelters that continue to have a provider on contract, yet an empty hotel shelter for the migrants. I'm gonna hand it over to Councilmember Brewer to continue questioning. I also wanna acknowledge Councilmember Ariola, Councilmember Aviles, and Councilmember Stevens for joining us.
Thank you. I just want to go back, Commissioner Park, to this same issue, which is if you are a single room occupancy shelter with a National Guard. I happen to think the National Guard is fabulous. I talk to them all the time. But then your staff comes and goes, so it makes it hard for those in the community to be able to be of assistance to the families because there's no consistency. My question is this: is there a nonprofit that is being paid even though they're not on site?
So all of our not-for-profits operate on a reimbursement basis, so they're going to have to show us the expenses that they incurred. So if they are not on site, if they have no staff there, they certainly can't bill us for staff that aren't there. Just to address the larger question of who is there, I am incredibly grateful for the National Guard, and I am incredibly grateful for the agency staff that is working overtime. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more that it is terrific to have city employees doing the work, but we're in a situation where everybody has a day job and we have this very unusual circumstance. So we have incredible frontline employees who are working overtime to do this work, and it does mean that there is some transition between
So are the
staff
groups
people.
that are supposedly going to be in these shelters getting advance payment even though they're not there? I know they will get reimbursed if they show up, because that's what we hear, and it's not transparent.
So we are following standard regulations around advance payments, but we also follow standard processes around recoupment. So if at the end of the day it takes longer than anticipated for a not-for-profit to come into the shelter, then when they do start to invoice, we will recoup against that advance. We work very hard to ensure that we are paying only for services received.
No, it's just back to the issue. Is the information is hard to come by, it's not transparent, and nobody knows what goes on. When you go to these locations, nobody, either the DHS nor the National Guard, has any clue about new nonprofits coming in, and these are the ones that don't have the diapers, the formulas, et cetera. I'm just pointing that out.
Certainly, if there is a site that is missing key
We
services.
tell you, but it's not that we should be doing that. Somebody from DHS knows about it and should be following up. I know you're overwhelmed, but there is a big disconnect on these contracts.
We take this responsibility very seriously. We have
Okay.
DHS staff that are full-time staff who are out doing site visits. I am not aware of a site that didn't have those core facilities, but I will certainly follow up with the team.
We gave them to your staff. Number two, thank you, George, for giving us the listing specific at HPD. My question is about the faith-based, since I know a lot about it. So my understanding is if you don't have a sprinkler, I'll make it specific. You can't get anybody in your space. Guess what? Nobody has a sprinkler. So you have this big 50 vision of faith-based. I believe there are 4 or 5 open. You're never going to get the rest of them open unless you have some changes at DOB. Nobody has 19 or 13. They can do 10. How in hell's name are you going to get all of these churches and faith-based open, because they're all calling me, and nobody is eligible under your crazy listings of what you need.
Yeah, I mean, like, the crazy listings are, an effort to keep people safe, to Councilmember
But they've been
Brewer.
doing the same work for 30 years without all these crazy listings.
No,
Regular New Yorkers.
we get it, and I think
And
we're
I've been
trying-
in them, so I know.
I know. Like, we're actually trying to ensure that there's like safety standards that we're adhering to, but at the same time, trying to help some of these houses of worship. We've actually contracted with NIDIS, the New York Disaster
I'm
Interfaith
aware of
Service. Okay. And, we're working with them, and they actually are trying to support these churches and synagogues and mosques and do the installation when necessary, So it is kind of slow going. but what we
Very.
wa- Yes, I get that, but we want to do it in a safe way.
All right,
So
but you're
we
going to have to make some changes in your crazy policies in order to get these, I'm just saying.
I get it, but like, we don't
Because you
necessarily
can't
think our
put in,
policies
you
are-
can't put in new sprinkler system and then have nobody come because you only have 10 spots and you don't have 19.
Right, so we're resourcing this too, and I think that's key here, right?
Giving
So-
them money? Is
Give-
that resourcing, what that means?
Yes.
Translation?
Correct. Translation, giving them money to do some of this work, right? To install sprinklers and showers. I think those are our two big issues, that we face in some of our
So I'll
houses of
tell the
worship.
people who are contacting me that you'll pay for the showers and the sprinklers.
We'd be happy to talk to all the people that are contacting you.
Okay. I want to go back to this issue of oversight. What checks are in place to oversee the work of these for-profit vendors? Because if I was DocGo or I was Arrow, I would want to be in this New York City job space forever, right? Because I am making money. And so I want to know, what are you doing to make sure that you are doing the right kind of oversight? Arrow is I understand that was competitively bid, that's my understanding. They suck. They are outside, everybody is complaining, they're outside hanging out. They said F you to the cops the other night. They are smoking weed around the corner. I met the president, very nice man. He doesn't live in New York City, so I'm always, if you don't live in New York City, I'm not so big on you. But I'm telling you, there's not enough oversight over Arrow. Who is in charge of overseeing Arrow?
So I can start, and then I'll see if George wants to add more about oversight too. Your two questions are, how does oversight work? And I'll speak from the point of view of our humanitarian centers, and specifically about Arrow, who is overseeing Arrow. So I'll take it in that order. So at all of our humanitarian centers, of which my teams currently run 15 today, I have a staff member, manager, and supervisor on site 24/7 without exception. Every service that we provide, whether it's security, food, medical, those are vendors that provide that service under the program that we designed and that my staff directly supervises on site, again, around the clock. That includes, to your specific question, my staff, my H&H staff, supervise Arrow. Same as in the hospitals. Now, with respect to Arrow specifically, we have also received feedback that Arrow could benefit from further trainings. And I wanted to outline, a lot of this is based on your feedback, Councilmember Brewer, what some of the changes that we're going to be making with Arrow going forward. So we're going to be arranging now a special training with Arrow that includes a few different components. One is the structure of the HERCs and the OEM system, getting to know some of the issues asylum seekers have, vigilance on posts with a no-phone policy, roving posts, which is different than in the hospitals because security guards, if you're in the hospital, you're in the hospital. But there's been a need, as you pointed out, to have security guards do more for our communities. We want to be good neighbors. So that's going to be part of our specific training here, and also new cultural training and professionalism training as well. So based on that feedback, we're making those changes now. I want to thank you for that. And I also want to say that for security going forward, we put out one of the 3 RFPs that I mentioned is for security. That RFP is closed, so we're going to soon be going through the process of, with the competitive bids, and again, there's no better way to make a process as competitive as possible than going through an RFP, that we're going to be potentially selecting new security vendors going forward through that process.
I don't know how much other security make, but these folks make more than police officers first year in the job. If you look at some of the sites are spending $25,000 a day on security. I mean, is that normal?
I would say to that there's no better way to ensure that we're being cost conscious and getting the best value with the lowest cost than going through the RFP process that we just concluded for security.
Okay, and how long is this Arrow contract so that you can do the bid?
So the RFP is already concluded. The Arrow contract that we initially went through, and just I said this earlier, but just in case anybody came in. So Arrow is the security vendor that we use, that we obtained through an RFP process for New York City Health and Hospitals. So my patients in my clinics and my hospitals, Arrow is our security vendor that was selected through that competitive process. When we opened the humanitarian centers, we had the opportunity to say, we have a contract already, as Commissioner Eskel said, we're going to use that same contract for very similar services, with the change being that there are some unique components and needs of asylum seekers, and based on Councilmember Brewer's feedback, we've arranged special training for Arrow. That we're going to be using a combination of Arrow, and we have another emergency security contract because Arrow did not have enough capacity to obtain the scale that we needed for the crisis until we've gone through the RFP process. RFP is closed, and we're moving as fast as we can on that.
Okay. The other issue about contracts in general is 40% of the contracts now, I think emergency and others, came from COVID. And so you say to the public, how in the world is it that 40% of the contracts that were used during COVID are now part of the migrant experience? And so that's, I mean, it's everything, as you can imagine, from DocGo, all of the hotel, and I know that's a unique situation, but that's one. Certainly the medical, I mean, there's MedRight is one of them. How do you explain, and maybe that's what your job is, I don't know, that 40% of the contracts that were part of the previous crisis, shall we say, are now part of this same, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. And so I'll turn this over to Charles in a second, but because that number doesn't sound right to us. I think that, again, I just ask, I just ask that we try and stick to facts.
No.
There are contracts that we might have had with vendors during COVID that could be a new contract with that vendor. There are also contracts like the one that you just referenced for Arrow Security as an emergency contract that are not emergency contracts. Those are competitively bid existing contracts.
And I said that. I said it was.
And so I just ask that we make sure that as we are navigating this, the contracting process is incredibly complicated. It's incredibly difficult. We are committed to transparency, but it's hard enough for the public and the press to understand what's going on without us conflating some of these issues. And I'll turn it over to Charles to talk a little bit about
40% is a big number, because what the public thinks is that you're just doing from one to the next, and there's no competitive, and therefore the for-profit, because that's what they are in most cases, not all, are making out like bandits.
Yeah, and thank you, Councilmember, for the opportunity to clarify, because it is important to note that difference, because that's not the case. So these COVID contractors, I'm not aware of a single contract for the asylum response that is being leveraged from a previous COVID contracts. When Mayor Adams came in, one of the first things that we did from a contracting standpoint was ensure that every single COVID contract had a plan for being wound down so that we could have the most competitive procedures, all of those things, and that was very successful. When this new emergency arose, my understanding is there might be overlap, 40% overlap in terms of the vendors being used, and I'll defer to those who make those choices as to why they made those choices. But structurally, I'm not aware of a single COVID contract, so to speak. Every single one had a new justification. There's not a single contract from COVID that is now just dragged over. All of them, to my knowledge, have had their own independent emergency analysis. They're not being carried over directly from
Just to
COVID.
clarify, we're not saying that it's the same contract. We're saying it's with the same vendors. 40% of them are with the same COVID-19 vendors, and the top 13 contracts where billions of dollars are going are to non-certified MWBEs, which then I can deduce that it's all going to white men.
Well, certainly I'll defer to the operating agencies as to the choices they've made, but I thank you for the opportunity to clarify that certainly, as you pointed out, Councilmember Brewer, that if there's a public perception that we're just taking these COVID contracts, that's certainly not the case, so I'll turn it over.
If I could chime in on some of the numbers. So I think we've referenced already that there are about 200 contracts in this asylum space. 127 of those are DHS. Those are human service contracts. They're with not-for-profit organizations. So first of all, many of them were operating for DHS during the COVID era, but as shelter operators, it's not specific to COVID, and by definition, they can't be classified as MWBE because they're not-for-profit organizations as opposed to for-profits.
Yeah, and just, sorry, Councilmember Brewer, for our upstate program, in addition to, we have a prime contract with for-profit, but a lot of our subcontractors are nonprofits, particularly those that do case management and social work, particularly in Monroe County and in Erie County. So these are groups that we know have a better connection and relationship to the community, so they understand their services that they refer folks in our care to. So, whenever possible, we like to subcontract with CBOs upstate.
But why can't you skip Doc Rowe and just subcontract with the services in Erie County?
Yeah, I think it's a combination.
That's the problem. It's
Yeah.
the for-profit with the shareholders who are making out like bandits.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is complement DocGo's kind of like speed, logistics, and mobilization with the local nonprofits who understand the human service component.
Okay. I think that the nonprofits could handle it. That's my feeling, very, very strongly. I want to ask, because I spent a lot of time with Department of Investigation. Part of the PEG letter the administration wants in their judgment is to reduce the cost of asylum seeker contracts. We all feel that way. But the fiscal 24 adopted budget included $4.6 million for an asylum seeker integrity monitorship at DOI. However, DOI has requested additional resources for its integrity monitorship unit that has not been funded. So I want to know if this administration intends to reduce costs of asylum seeker contracts. Wouldn't it make sense to have this overseeing unit? Now, of course, you've got the controller looking over you, you've got the city council, but this particular unit would be very, very helpful. What do you say to that asylum seeker integrity monitorship?
Councilmember, I'm not familiar exactly with that budget appropriation. I would say the Department of Investigation is engaged in oversight of our asylum response right now. That was something
With the monitor, that's the
yes.
monitor.
Yeah, so that is in place right now. If it's regarding if that's a different appropriation, I apologize. I have to get back to you. I'm not
They
sure.
need more money.
Well, I'll certainly defer to OMB.
And it's
others.
always important to have money for oversight. That's what the issue is, so you could bring that back. Number two, have there been any vendors or contracts referred to DOI for fraud or overbilling or abuse? Have any contracts that, to the best of your knowledge, from your agency? None? Okay. And then have any contracts been terminated at all, just out of curiosity, for any reason whatsoever from this particular crisis?
Sure, I could chime in. In our upstate, a couple of our upstate locations, in particular Albany, we've had difficulty with a couple of our security vendors, subcontractors. Councilmember, it's not the prime contract. And whenever we go to new places, we try to find local contractors to work with. And in this case, one of them in particular was a local MWBE, worked with former veterans. And so it was an effort to kind of like connect to a local subcontractor. But we had issues with that particular security vendor, so we've terminated that contract in particular.
Okay, I'm going to call next. We're going to come back for a second round. Councilmember Holden.
Thank you, chairs, and thank you all for your hard work. I imagine it's some 24-hour days that you guys have some sleepless nights, and I thank you for all the hard work. Some questions. Who in the administration, there's a bunch of articles on .go. We all read that, and there were some allegations. They were promised jobs, security guards threatening migrants, lack of coordination with some of the cities upstate. Migrants didn't receive medical. Some migrants, the allegations, they were dumped in the middle of nowhere. Who in the administration was looking at that? Did you find them somewhat credible? 1 second. I just want to get. I'm going to have a second part of that question because I may run out of time. They only gave us 2 minutes. So, Mr. Sarkisian, you mentioned, by the way, there was xenophobia from some people upstate, from elected officials. I think you're mentioning. You mentioned it twice. First of all, what were some of? Why did you arrive at that? Maybe they didn't feel they could handle, the migrants. But how do you leverage that? Would you say that the administration is xenophobic, since the administration is challenging the right to shelter? So the very services you're providing, the administration is challenging, yet they're not xenophobic, but people upstate are.
Sure. So the people upstate that we're talking about used very dangerous rhetoric, about some of our.
Like what? Like, tell me what they said.
We'll get you a list of quotes, but if.
Elected officials, you said.
Yeah, town supervisors, county executives, local assembly members in Newburgh in particular, made the case that, there were folks that were kicked out of our Newburgh hotel because of our asylum seekers, and it was an effort to actually block our asylum seekers from coming to Newburgh, and it was later, and then we later found out it was actually a lie, the local folks, that were making up that lie and kind of convinced the local assembly member that local veterans were displaced by our asylum seekers, made up a lie, right? So there's actually systematic.
Right, that was proven. That was proven.
That was proven.
I'm saying that you're challenging the right to shelter. You're actually saying that we shouldn't be doing this.
If I can jump in, we are
Well,
currently...
no, because he made allegations. I want to know. I wanted just an answer to, first of all, some of the allegations against DOCO, which I didn't. I want to hear that first.
I'm happy to talk about the allegations against DOCO. If you want to list them individually, we can go through them individually.
No, I just want some of the. What did you find?
Yeah. So we work closely. Actually, there's a lot of places that are actually willing to work with us, and we've developed good relationships with the County of Albany, with Monroe County, where Rochester is, with Erie County, where Buffalo is, and we've developed relationships with county executives, county, city mayors, town supervisors.
Albany.
Yeah,
right.
We've developed really actually good relationships with these places. So in addition to the elected officials, we've developed relationships with CBOs that we're actually often subcontracting with, right? And we have a really good relationship with the New York Immigration Coalition. So we have a lot of folks that are quite active and are in these places and in our facilities, and we're talking to them every day, actually. It's a full-time job, the upstate hoteling program. So our efforts, to correct when allegations come up are the result of direct communication with a lot of these folks, And so when there's a subcontractor that's not doing what they're supposed to do, right? We mentioned a subcontractor.
So some of these were credible.
Yeah,
and you
absolutely.
corrected it.
We've corrected a lot of it.
You found out you got rid of that subcontractor.
Correct.
It wasn't .go.
Yeah, it was not .go that we got rid of. No, it was
None of them. None of the allegations were caused by .go.
No, we're talking about operational issues that we've had to correct.
I get it.
In any big operation with 5,000 asylum seekers or shelter guests, there are issues to work out, and we work them out. We're talking to them every day.
Right, but okay. Now addressing the right to shelter, we're challenging that in court. Tell me how that all fits in here.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to DHS on that.
New York City is currently sheltering more than 60,000 asylum seekers. In addition to other New Yorkers experiencing homelessness, we have a deep-seated commitment to keeping people off the street and ensuring that we are providing shelter. I think we are looking at what is the most appropriate way of doing so, but with more than 100,000 people between the asylum seekers and other individuals experiencing shelter in the city's care right now, I don't think it's appropriate to argue that we are stepping away from our responsibility to extremely low-income New Yorkers.
Well, how would you explain it then? If you're challenging the right to shelter, and you're bending over back, you're actually working night and day. You're working crazy hours, like I said before. You're not getting sleep. We're spending billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and yet you're challenging right to shelter. So at one point, what do we do then with the migrants who are coming in? And let's say you win in court.
Again, I'm going to say the city is currently sheltering more than 100,000 individuals between asylum seekers and other New Yorkers. We are deeply committed to meeting the needs of extremely low-income New Yorkers, and we are looking at the most appropriate ways.
So there is a breaking point.
Councilmember, I got so many people asking questions. We can come back.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember
Thank you.
Hanif.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I want to dive into .go. Commissioner Iskall, you mentioned that bags of cash are not being handed to vendors, but we know that NYSEM did not properly vet .go nor provide justification for the award. I just want to finish before you chime in. .go received a $432 million no-bid contract without relevant experience that has now been accused of sexual assault of clients in the city's custody, issuing fraudulent documents to clients in the city's custody, and questionable use of funds. And then the administration has doubled down aggressively defending .go, despite the very legitimate issues raised by our state attorney general, the city comptroller, and investigative reporters. And then when faced with legitimate criticism on this contract, the mayor has simply gone into us against them mode, dismissing it as politically motivated when it is clear that there's substantive problems here. I just want to better understand what the specific parameters are around .go in particular. Where is the administration on transitioning away from emergency procurement towards standard contracting practices? And you know, .go is making a lot of profit off of this contract also. I'd like to just understand the parameters of contracting and specifically about .go, given all of the serious allegations. And then my the final thing I'd like to learn a little bit more about is 163rd Street Improvement Council. They operate a shelter in Sunset Park, and then one in my district in Gowanus, and we've heard many issues around wage theft, and there was news about sexual harassment in the emergency shelter, specifically in Sunset Park. Could you share what steps the admin takes when issues like this arise with providers and sometimes smaller providers, and what is the accountability mechanism here?
So you're specifically asking me about the .go contract?
Anybody can respond, but I just wanted to point out the bit about the bags of cash. But the other bit I also just want to acknowledge is I appreciated, George, your comment about the xenophobia upstate. But I also want to be clear that the mayor has also created this division by saying asylum seekers are going to destroy New York City. That also incites a xenophobia. It incites the violence that we are going to see with directives like the 60-day and 30-day rules. So, you know, Councilmember Holden brings up a really good point around what are these allegations of xenophobia, but we need to admit that this administration is also fueling that xenophobia.
So, as always, Councilmember, thank you for your questions. So first off, in terms of the process, as you are aware, emergency management does not hold the .go contract. It's an HPD contract. With that said, that contract, as all emergency procurements do, obtained prior approval from the comptroller and from the law department. It also received final approval from the comptroller and the law department. The comptroller also filed that contract, which is what you do. It's the same as registering the contract, but under emergency procedures.
Can you just walk me through like all of these issues that I've raised? Like what happens now?
I'm trying to answer your questions, and I will turn it over to George to talk specifically about .go. With that said, at our respite sites, when there's an allegation towards a staff member or somebody there, we take that very seriously. And to Councilmember Brewer's question about terminating contracts, we have not terminated any contracts, but we have terminated folks who are employed by certain contracts because of their behavior at those sites. And those are things that we have had to do, unfortunately, but we take all of those allegations very seriously. And I'll turn it over to George to speak more specifically about .go to answer those questions.
I'd love to see just a report or to get a clearer understanding of how many people have been let go and from which groups, because 163rd Council and some of these other providers are operating in our districts, and it's important for us to be engaged and not to learn just through the news. And we need to be prepared as a city to be able to have accountability as we continue to welcome asylum seekers and as we want to encourage other providers to be involved as well.
Yeah. I just want to say it is complicated to understand why HPD is in charge of .go and also help the council member and all of us understand this cross-agency, because it is so many agencies involved. Why HPD is doing .go for H&H, but there are separate kinds, but this cross-agency confusion. Can you explain it?
Yeah, so, sorry, I don't know which one you want me to answer first, because we have, Councilmember Hanif asking George about .go. I'm happy to talk about the interagency process. Where do you want us to start?
They're both important questions, and I think this is just
But we can't both
demonstrating the
speak at the same
confusion
time, so-
that
Start
we're
with George
experiencing.
and then you.
Right.
Yeah, let me just talk a little bit about .go. Thanks, Councilmember Haney, for the question. Like, we take all the allegations seriously, right? They're people in our care, and they're our responsibility. You know, the folks at HPD, Councilmember Brewer, care a lot about the work. You know, like the work that we're doing, we care a lot about it. So we put in the hours, and we take the allegations seriously. We don't like rest on any of it and assume stuff is not true when it might be true. So we
What's the taking seriously part?
So this is what we do. Like, we're every 10 a.m. hour in the morning, every day, I'm talking to .go, right? And anytime we hear an allegation, we'll bring it to their attention, you know? And they actually are pretty good at looking into these allegations, you know? And what they do is they, you know, contact staff on site, get a sense of what's happening, report back, and they usually do it in the matter of like minutes to an hour, you know? And then what we do is work out the response together, you know? And that's like how we do this oversight. And we've made changes as a result of these allegations, you know? There are, like I said, subcontractors that we've removed, you know? There are people that have are no longer working at these sites, you know, because of some of the things that they have potentially done, you know? So we want to protect our asylum seekers. You know, a lot of these incidents actually involve us, you know, conducting orientations. You know, when people come and arrive at our centers, we want to make sure everyone understands there's a code of conduct that everyone has to kind of, you know, adhere to. You know, we do domestic violence training, you know, for all of our for all the employees and all the asylum seekers that are coming, so they understand what's prohibited and what's not, you know? So we do a lot of that, and we do a lot of the course correction. And look, talking to the new president, so the new CEO, Lee Beanstalk, you know, we've agreed that for now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna focus on refining operations, you know? I think there was an effort in the past to expand quickly. We're going to work on what we have, you know, to get it right and make sure that, you know, the asylum seekers that are in our care are getting the level of service that they need and deserve.
And to answer Councilmember Brewer's question, so as you are all aware, we've been saying this now for over a year, this is an unprecedented emergency. We have over 100,000 people in the city's care. 60,000 of them are asylum seekers or migrants. We have opened up over 200 emergency shelters. There is no single agency that can handle it on its own. And this is the normal course of business when we have an emergency. When we had the tragic building collapse down on Ann Street, we relied on other agencies to do the demolition contract, to help us with the removal of the vehicles, to set aside places for those vehicles to go. When we had the tragic Bronx fire, we leaned very heavily on HPD because of their expertise with the American Red Cross and the housing contract. It is very normal in the city. And so to answer your question specifically, when we have an emergency, one of the things we do is we look at what agency has specific expertise to the problem that needs to be solved. In this case, DSS and DHS, of course, they have a lot of capacity and ability, and that's why they have shouldered more of this burden than any other agency. But Health and Hospitals and HPD also have expertise when it comes to sheltering and housing people. When we opened up the respite centers, we were specifically adopting a model we use for coastal storm shelters. It's not ideal, but in this unprecedented emergency, we have had to rely on every single bit of expertise that exists in a variety of different agencies to handle it. And that's one of the reasons you see so many agencies participate. And I think that's a strength, not a weakness.
I agree. I think it's agencies that participate, but you have, I don't know how many laundry companies are participating. I have no idea. But I'm just saying, you have a laundry company, HPD has a laundry company, DSS has a laundry company, H&H, I don't know.
We also rely on each
all
other's
have laundry
contracts,
companies.
but sometimes those contractors are no longer able to do all the work themselves, in which case we have to find a new vendor, which is what we've done in a lot of cases.
Okay.
Or they might be specific to a certain type of service.
That's different
for some
than city
reason.
workers working together, if I may say so. It's very, to me, it's very different.
Councilmember Hanif, I can speak to the 163rd Street Improvement Council. They're a DHS contractor. They were not a contractor that we worked with before this particular set of circumstances. As I mentioned, we reached out and have contracted with a number of new providers because the scope of the issue was so significant. They absolutely have had some challenges with their operations. It has been, and some real issues there. We have scaled back our footprint with 163rd Street Improvement Council, and we are monitoring and working with them very closely. I will say I think this is a reflection of us trying to move quickly, of them trying to grow quickly with us. Our goal is always to get not-for-profit providers to the place where they can provide services that are of the quality that we expect and you expect. That was not initially the case with the 163rd Street Improvement Council, but I believe we can get there.
I really appreciate that response. Thank you. And to what, George, you shared, I'm still a bit baffled by the .go situation, particularly the egregious allegations and the ways in which they're treating clients. So I'd like to follow up, but it's good to know that there are some parameters that you're all setting, but it's still very unclear whether the admin is in charge when allegations come up versus the organization or the vendor needing to figure out how to assemble itself.
We're in charge, 1,000%.
Okay,
We're
because
making the
if that's
calls.
the case,
if subcontractors are replaced, it's because we've replaced them.
Right, and
People are let
since
go
that's the
because we told
case,
them that.
since that's the case, it's really important that we see efficacy and that we receive more transparency when there are vendors out here who are charged with sexual assault and all of these other issues of mismanagement, because then it actually reflects that the administration is incapable of managing this situation.
Yeah, we should talk about a vendor being accused of sexual assault, because that's unfamiliar to me. But there have been incidents in our .go hotels, and we respond to them. And you know what? We're happy to actually invite you to visit any of our .go hotels. We actually have 15 of them down here in the city. So if you'd like to visit any of our hotels, it's an open invitation. You just let me know.
To follow up, from yesterday's visit of the two DACO sites in my district, we learned that the hotel DACO sites will no longer provide any sort of medical services on site. And to their contract, it says that they will have on-site medical 12 hours per day, $250 per hour. So can you tell me when this policy was changed and how the contract will be amended?
Yeah. So what we're doing now in our downstate hotels and actually all of our HERCs, we're moving to telehealth, right? All of our individuals in our care downstate here in the city will have access to telehealth when they need it. So they'll be able to see somebody. And we actually benefit from one of the best public healthcare systems in the world, here in New York City. So we're working closely with H&H whenever anybody needs actual medical care. There are clinics, urgent care, hospital system that they can get care from, So we're making sure that they have access, and we're paying for the transportation. So we're trying to be thrifty, but we're also making sure that our clients have the care they need.
Oh, okay, I'd love to jump in on that. We've put, a lot of thought into what the medical needs of asylum seekers are. Our initial model, one of the key lessons that we learned taking care of asylum seekers is they have a tremendous amount of upfront needs. They may have had chronic diseases that they didn't know about, or that had gone inadequately treated over time. When they arrive here in New York City, they present to us with immediate healthcare needs. So at any of our new sites that we're opening, new humanitarian centers, and certainly the Arrival Center, we have a concerted effort to continue to provide healthcare services for people that are newly incoming. Over time, the right answer to healthcare services has to be that every asylum seeker in New York City needs to have a doctor like me, a primary care doctor. So we're making that transition now towards connecting our asylum seekers into longitudinal ongoing care. To give some statistics to back that up, just to point out the immediate need, this still just overwhelms me. Over 36,000 vaccines that our teams have administered at the Arrival Center and our humanitarian centers. Just speaking to the tremendous medical need that people have immediately, that you can't wait to get your MMR and varicella vaccines, and they aren't getting it in Texas. We need to do it here now. We are doing it. It's a human right, and it's very important. Going beyond there, though, our goal now is to connect people to health insurance. We've helped 14,000 asylum seekers apply for health insurance thus far. 14,000. That's 14,000 lives potentially saved. Health insurance is crucial. Beyond that, too, we've had 29,000 visits of asylum seekers just at New York City Health and Hospitals. So you could see the progression there. of addressing people's immediate needs and then transitioning them into our world-class primary care system at New York City Health and Hospitals, and that will be where they can get a doctor like me, whose name they will know, will be their go-to going forward, and that's plugging them into healthcare in the right way for themselves and their kids longitudinally.
Can you get dental telehealth-wise?
You can. So dental can be, many dental conditions can be urgent conditions. So we are, the answer is if it's an urgent condition that the telehealth doctor or virtual express care emergency doctor, nurse practitioner, or provider can handle, they can do it via telehealth. Otherwise, we've actually already activated our dental council at New York City Health and Hospitals to think about the right pathways to connect asylum seekers. What Councilmember Brewer is referring to is
They all have dental issues.
We're seeing, thank you. You don't need me to tell you. There are certain issues asylum seekers have that we want to make sure that we are immediately addressing. I would say dental is a big one. Mental health is a huge one. And also, I should say, up front too, all asylum seekers coming into the arrival center, we don't just screen you for medical or communicable diseases. We don't just talk to you about chronic diseases. All asylum seekers 12 and up get screened for depression, and we're seeing a fair amount of depression. And if you screen positive at a certain level, it's the same protocol I use in my practice in the Bronx. We have social workers on site on the second floor that have an immediate warm handoff and discussion with you. All of that's to make the point for George. They're putting the services up front that we know people need because they've never gotten them before, and then we're making a concerted effort, which we've succeeded with. 14,000 people enrolled in health insurance, 29,000 completed medical visits at my clinics alone. That's the direction we're trying to go in.
I just want to put on the record that for my district, and I followed up with DOCO directly, that we've had reports from local clinics that have been referred out from the HERCs to them for free instead of to the H&H sites. So I'm going to continue to keep an eye on that to make sure that they are being referred to the right places, not clinics that are not getting funded to do this work. I wanted to further ask questions about the hotel rooms. So, George, can you confirm that the amendment for the policy change to not have healthcare professionals on site was made and when to the contract? When was that amendment made?
So there was no change to the contract, right? Like to the point I was making, Councilmember Shanif, we're instructing them what to do, right? And we're telling them how to do it. So this is just kind of an ongoing conversation we've had, and we've essentially implemented all the changes that Dr. Ted talked about.
And just one more point there. Not only have we gone in the intentional direction of connecting people to primary care, which I think is incredibly important, but in addition to that, we've only done that in terms of transitioning at sites where people have been for a longer period of time. And when we make that transition, we intentionally install virtual express care, which is something that we developed at New York City Health and Hospitals during COVID, where you could basically on your phone or on an iPad log in and have a telehealth visit, as Councilmember Brewer was referring to, with a provider in a matter of minutes, and they can address an array of conditions. So it's one of those innovations during COVID that we're able to now use to help people going forward.
How much is that contract?
You what?
How much is that contract?
That's not a contract. That is New York City Health and Hospitals doctors.
I want to acknowledge Comptroller Brad Lander has joined us, and since the Comptroller's decision to disapprove the DOCO contract, we've seen many reports in the news publicly, and one of them is that the hotel rooms on the DOCO contract are $170 per room per night, and we have seen in reports that they get to keep the profit when it is less than $170. Can you comment on that?
Before we do, I just want to issue my apologies. I have to leave. I have a hard stop at 2:30. Chris Blanco, who is our agency's chief financial officer, will be taking my seat if the committee council wants to swear him in. Also, it is my understanding, but I will let George speak to this, that the comptroller actually did in fact file that contract, the equivalent of registering it, and did approve it. But I will turn it back over to you, George, and Chris is going to take my seat.
Sure.
Thank
And
you.
the Comptroller would be testifying as well.
To the question about hoteling and the cost in our DOCO contract, so $170 is the rate that we landed in our contract. And just to be clear about that's $170 per room per night, both upstate and downstate. So upstate we have 13 hotels, downstate we have 15 hotels, right? And so we landed on that number, based on some comps we looked at, and it's an issue of predictability. We needed to budget and know how much money we have in our budget, ensure we had enough money in our budget, because it's the largest cost that we bear, right? The hoteling cost. So it was an issue of predictability to make sure we had enough money in our budget. And I could tell you for a fact, the downstate hotels, particularly this past summer, were all more than $170, Councilmember Juan. And so it averaged out is what we're trying to tell you, right? All the downstate hotels are expensive. The upstate hotels, for sure, are cheaper. $170 is kind of a middle ground.
Okay, because $170 per night per hotel room, many, like the one in my district, is very small. That's $5,100 per month for these families. That's enough for me to get them a nice luxury rental with a doorman and a pool in my district. So I look forward to listening to the long-term plans for housing these folks. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Williams to ask her questions.
And also Councilmember Kirsten has joined us, and after Williams is Councilmember Joseph.
Thank you, chairs. I know the commissioner left, but I just wanted to say that I'm offended and also confused by the very broad characterization of the council that we're purposely trying to spread misinformation. The council is not a monolith. There's 51 of us. I can't speak for my colleagues, but it's very offensive to hear folks say that to us when I know central staff, I know individually we've asked the administration for information. We can't know something if we're not told, and so we rely on sometimes the media, what we hear, what we see from providers, what information we can scrape up from FOIL documents that you guys redact and other public information. So I really just wanted to say that, and just the notion that it's unfair for us to question and try to seek out these answers that we've asked off the record and now asking on the record. So I really felt the need to say that I'm both offended and very confused by those comments, because what's really unfair is that there are a lot of people that actually want to work with the administration in partnership and want to have the information to properly assess and go back to our communities to stop the rumors, because we know how dangerous that can be. So my first question is, I know you all spoke about the pre-approvals for contracts. I just had a clarifying question, because I know sometimes agencies will have RFPs out for pre-approvals. They may not call you right away, but if something happens, they can go from a list, which tends to shorten the procurement process. So I just wanted to know, I've heard you guys say pre-approvals a few times, so I just wanted to know if the pre-approvals list was a list that you already had, or was it a new list? Are you working off of a list? The next question that I have is, if you could just give me some details on how each of your respective agencies are providing oversight of current facilities to ensure that issues are addressed in expedience. I know there has been reports of inadequate resources, services, leaks, physical issues. I wanted to also know the coordination between the agencies and your coordination with other jurisdictions. I have some friends in other jurisdictions, and I've heard quite a few horror stories about the lack of coordination from the city and their respective counties in welcoming people. And last but not least, in my district, I have the Central Library, and they are very happy to welcome folks who are trying to get IDNYC, and they've been doing really good with partnering with them in HRA. But I have heard and seen that at 4 or 5 a.m., people are lining up around the block to get these services. And so just wondering what support we can offer, and if you have any future RFPs that really seek to address some of the service gaps. Thank you.
If I can just respond to your initial comment before passing it over to my colleagues here. I don't think the commissioner was trying to imply that there are specific, attempts by the council to confuse people. I don't think that's the case at all. I think the point he was trying to make is that this is all very, very complicated, right? And I think everyone here acknowledges that. There's a lot of agencies involved, there's a lot of work involved, and just the sheer size of the response to asylum seekers is tremendous and a huge strain on the city's resources. I think what we, as an administration, I think we share a lot of sort of the same feelings that you have as well, right? Which is, it's complicated, right? There's, I think, a lot of bad faith assumptions that people aren't doing things or aren't trying to do things. I don't think anyone pretends that everything is perfect here. But I think what we as an administration feel and see, right, is that it is a very complicated, complex response. It's a complex national issue across the board. So before sort of attacking us for saying that we're not doing something, I think a lot of the times the goal here is for us to try to unpack how things work.
I'm sorry, I really was gonna let you speak, but I think just as Commissioner felt like there was some misunderstandings, I think you all have misunderstandings as well. I think you confuse attack with our obligations to provide oversight. And so, again, I cannot speak for my colleagues, and I really just don't want to waste anyone's time, so we can just jump into the questions. I appreciate you trying to respond to my comment. It wasn't necessary. I just wanted to say for the record that I personally am offended and quite confused by the comments. And asking questions isn't to attack, it's to find the accurate information that we were accused of not having.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Councilmember, I'm happy to jump in and start with the questions. I think we're all going to have different answers about PQLs, about pre-qualified lists, so I'll start and then I will also address the IDNYC lines. So at DHS, DSS, we don't have any pre-qualified lists. So we did an RFP from scratch for our sanctuary sites. I think the pre-approvals that we were referencing was we were able to clear some pieces of the approval process that are on the normal contracting piece so that we could move the process more quickly. But the vendors that we're working with were selected specifically for the purpose here. Again, different agencies may have different answers. IDNYC is within our space. There has been a tremendous demand for IDNYC. We don't specifically track documentation status of those applying. That's very intentional because we don't want to have that record available for others. But what I know is that we saw almost twice as many applications in calendar year 22 as calendar year 21, which we certainly attribute to the asylum seekers. We are hiring within the IDNYC space. We've added staff. We are working very closely with my colleagues here to make sure that we are streamlining the process as much as possible. Early on in this, we added different forms of documentation that would count as ID points for IDNYC. One of the things that we've learned recently was that people were getting rejected because they were putting down a variety of addresses that weren't residential addresses on their application. So we've been working really closely with H&H to make sure that we are able to give people a centralized address so that no matter what, they can apply. So that's still a work in progress, but we realize how important it is, and so we're looking for ways to streamline. And then I guess to speak to agency coordination, I text with this group a lot. So there is a lot of very personal coordination. There's also City Hall is playing a really active and aggressive role in making sure that we are all talking, whether that is standing phone calls, sharing reports. It has certainly been iterative. This is an evolving process. There have been moments where it isn't perfect, but I do think that we've built really, really strong interagency relationships. And, I know I can go to anybody on this panel in a heartbeat and they come to me. So, although it is not perfect, it is very strong.
That's important. And just to give an example of that too, City Hall does provide a really critical coordinating effort across everything that we're doing, including at 9:30 p.m. last night when we had a meeting about the exciting news for temporary protected status for Venezuelans. To answer your specific questions, I think for the pre-qual, Charles and Chris, maybe you guys might want to share some thoughts on that, and then maybe we can quickly go over your oversight question, because I think George was sharing earlier that he has a new oversight unit that he's developing.
Yeah, I would quickly say in terms of the use of pre-qualification lists, council member, an agency can use a pre-qual within an emergency. They can use a standard pre-qualification list to respond to an emergency. And of course, you use the phrase prior, kind of prior approval. That also triggers what we talk about when we talk about the controller's prior approval. So it could mean any of those. I just wanted to clarify that you certainly could use a PQL in that instance. I believe HPD does on occasion. And I'll turn it back over to George.
Yeah, and just on the question of oversight, it's something we obviously take seriously. It's easier to do when you're down here in the city than in Buffalo, New York, right? And we actually rely on a lot of our partners upstate to provide us feedback that we kind of incorporate into operations and make the tweaks we need to make. But like Dr. Ted Long was saying, we're actually standing up a new team, right? Dedicated staff to give us greater visibility into these sites upstate in particular. So that's something that we're in the process of doing.
I missed the oversight question, apologies. So our standard structure within the Department of Homeless Services, which we've expanded to include the asylum sites as well, We have assistant commissioners. Reporting to the assistant commissioners are what we call program administrators, and then they have program analysts reporting to them. So the program analysts can be out in the field. They can have eyes on what's going on. The program administrators are also out in the field, although they have a larger portfolio, and then they report up to the assistant commissioners. So we have eyes on the ground and a clear escalation path so that if there are issues. But certainly, you know, we have an ombudsman so that clients can report issues directly to us, so that those get to us. And to the extent that, you know, we miss things, because things can happen, we certainly appreciate feedback from you and your colleagues.
And just to quickly go over the H&H oversight process. So our sites are larger, so I have 15 humanitarian centers and the arrival center, and we run them like a hospital. In a hospital, there has to be one person in charge. That's the CEO. So at each of my sites, I have a supervisor, an administrator. They're actually physically on site in charge of all the different services, whether it's medical, food, laundry, security, you name it. All the services roll up to my supervisor and administrator, and they're in charge of all operations on site around the clock. Any issues that come up, they're the ones that deal with it. So at H&H, yeah, we are in charge of all of our sites with on-site staff.
Councilmember Joseph.
Before we move to Councilmember Joseph, I just need to swear in Mr. Blanco from NYSEM. Can you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your response to Councilmember questions?
I do.
Thank you.
Councilmember Joseph, and then Councilmember Vernicoff.
Thank you, chairs. Just have a few questions around the hotels. How do you decide where you're going to place a hotel? For example, you placed a hotel in my district. I got a call. I knew about it, visited. Good. There's another hotel that was contracted in my district. No one told me until I was walking down in the district and I saw the folks sitting outside and they stumbled into my office looking for services. How do you choose the sites, and how come the local council members are not made aware of these hotels opening? Not that we have a problem, but maybe we can better coordinate in partnership. How I found out, I'm also the education chair. Principals are calling me. Council member, I got 15 people standing in front of me right now, and that was a school in my district. 15 families standing, no support. No one picked up the phone and said, Council member, please support. How can our office support? How can we do this better? And I'm also getting a lot of phone calls from parents. When children, you have 60,000 asylum seekers in your care. How many of them are children? Have they been vaccinated? That's what some of my families have been asking. Also, what's the percentage on communicable disease outbreaks? They want to know that. How are we treating our new New Yorkers, our families? So those are very important questions. And moving forward, I would love better communication between the agencies, also with the local council members. I shouldn't have to walk down Flatbush to see families sitting outside, or someone shouldn't have to stumble into my office to say, hey, could you guide us to the next pantry? And I'll pick up the phone and be like, this is where the next pantry is. The summer school, for example, summer school program was feeding students up until September. That should have been announced in all of the shelters. That was not. I had to pick up the phone and call New York City Public Schools and said that announcement should have been made to families to let them know their resources, because in the hotel, I know there's a mini fridge and there's a microwave. There's no food, and there's no way they can cook food. So I need to know, moving forward, as of today, how we're going to look on community engagement with the local community and the local council members. We've been doing this. A principal shouldn't have to call me. We were on the grounds from day one. When we got those families, food distribution was done, coats were ready, backpacks and supplies, all of that was done. We're here, as my council member said, to be partners. But we want to be good partners, but if you're not communicating with us, I won't know. If a tree falls in the forest, I don't know it falls unless you tell me.
Understood. Thank you, Council Member. Let me start, and then my colleagues can chime in. We have a lot of the hotels at DSS, but not all of the hotels. So in terms of how we cite and how we select, we are in constant negotiations with hotels. We are looking for sites that have sort of a critical mass of rooms, right? There are a handful of boutique hotels that, you know, if it's 20 units, it probably doesn't make sense for us because it's just very, very challenging to operate. On the converse, if it's too large, that's very difficult for DSS as well. So we're looking for moderate-sized hotels where we can negotiate a reasonable rate. It's very important that we're providing services and shelter for everybody who needs it, but we also want to make sure we're being responsible with city resources. So that is the how do we find them ongoing negotiation. It is standard DSS policy to notify the council member. In the case of these emergencies, sometimes it is very, very short notice. And if we have been moving very quickly in some cases. If we have missed some, I apologize, and we will focus on making sure that we are doing better. I do want to clarify, all of our sites, any hotel or any other shelter where there are not cooking facilities for the clients, everybody is provided with 3 meals a day. So that doesn't mean that they might not sometimes use pantries and other resources in the neighborhood, but I just want to be clear on the record that there are meals, there's fruit provided around the clock, people have access to milk, other kinds of things.
Are they culturally relevant?
Sorry?
Are they culturally relevant?
So we're working with a variety of food vendors. Our providers are working with a variety of food vendors. We are serving so many different cultures at this point. Many of the asylum seekers are coming from South and Latin America, but we're also serving people from Western Africa, increasingly from Ukraine and other Russian-speaking countries. So culturally relevant means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So there's a variety of food provided within the shelters. I am sure it is not exactly what everybody would pick at all times. But we are sure that we are confident that there is food that meets the New York City standards. It's available. There's fruit and other kinds of snacks that are available around the clock. But again, coordination with you and with your colleagues is really important to us, and we are happy to look at ways that we can do it better.
And if I can jump in, I wanted to make sure we answered all of your questions. I'll promise I'll be my less verbose self, but I wrote down all your questions. So your first was the number of children. I'll answer from the point of view of my H&H HERCs. The specific numbers are we have a denominator of about 20,000 people currently at H&H HERCs today. About 2,300 are under 5. 5 to 17 is about 4,300, and then the rest are above that. So there's specific numbers. Your second was around vaccines and communicable disease screening and care. So for vaccines, I'm really proud of the fact that we have administered nearly 37,000 vaccines at the arrival center and at my humanitarian centers thus far in the crisis. The way it works now, because we're still seeing a tremendous need for this, so the way it works now is all asylum seekers are intended to come through the front door of the Roosevelt Hotel, our arrival center, and then when you're waiting to go through intake, I have a roving series of teams that come up and offer you and your family vaccines. People are not reticent about vaccines, they just literally haven't had access to them before. Either they were too expensive in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, or they just hadn't seen a doctor before. A crazy example of not having seen a doctor before is 3 days ago, we had a woman that came in, was going through our medical part of our intake, and she received her first prenatal visit from us, and she was 9 months pregnant. So she'd never seen a doctor before. So just to point out, people have not gotten the care that they deserve before they get here, but 37,000 vaccines administered. For communicable disease screening, that's the first thing we do at the arrival center is we screen for active tuberculosis, varicella, or chickenpox, which is not endemic to countries people are coming from. So we do a full body skin exam because they're at very high risk for contracting it because their body hasn't seen it before, and also COVID as well. Varicella, by the way, to your point, the reason we're doing a screening for that is because we saw cases initially. So now we're seeing who has it now. They immediately get isolated if they have that rash. And then we have the opportunity, if it's in the right window, to give a prophylactic vaccine to those that may have been exposed to them. The most common vaccines that we're giving, by the way, are varicella and MMR, which is just heartbreaking that we're having to vaccinate kids, sometimes older kids, for things that could kill them like measles, which everybody in the U.S. has received. So we do better by people when they get here. Your last question is about culturally relevant food. One thing we do at all of our humanitarian centers and the arrival center is 100% of our food is halal. Just as an example, because when we started to see Muslim guests, initially we had a food truck, but that was only a temporary solution. And then we just figured it would be easier to make sure that people didn't have to choose between different food options. They could know that all food was culturally appropriate for them. Then I won't tell my story about this, but then after that we did a campaign to have people evaluate meals because we had this interesting problem of what meals do people from Senegal and Venezuela both like? And there is an answer to that question, but you only know if you ask people and have them rate the individual meals, and the answer is Italian food.
From HPD's perspective, in terms of like site selection, hotel site selection, the criteria Commissioner Park rattled off is our criteria too, right? In terms of protocols and outreach, that's exactly what we're supposed to do. So first, it would be helpful if maybe you can tell us where this hotel is. So between the three of us, we could tell you who you need to reach out to if you ever have a problem. That would be helpful. I know sometimes the outreach doesn't work. I know for Councilmember Wan, we had a hotel that we stood up in her district and we didn't make the connection, so that's on us and we've got to do better. So let us know where it is. We'll do better. We'll reach out to you, and you have a point of contact at the very least that you can reach out to if you have issues.
Also, if you want to just send any one of us, we'll sort it out on the back end.
Sure, you could do that too. Yeah.
I sure will. All right.
Councilmember Renikoff?
Thank you, chairs. First, I'd like to just clarify how many emergency contracts which provide services to migrants have been executed since October 7th, 2022, when the mayor declared a state of emergency.
So thank you, Councilmember. In terms of contracts to respond to the emergency, and I would clarify it in that way, we're looking at about 205. It is changing every day. But we're looking at about 205 contract actions. The reason I caveated myself, Councilmember, is because as Commissioner Park spoke well about, a lot of this response to an emergency, it can be an amendment to an existing contract that you're leveraging. It can be it can be a full emergency contract. In some cases, we've done full RFPs, full bids to respond to it. So I would classify this as these are the contracts that we're tracking as our response to the emergency. They aren't all going to be procured through the emergency method. So we would say about 205 contracts.
Okay, thank you. And what's the total cost these contracts add up to, do you know?
So in terms of the cost, I will defer to the testimony that I believe George gave. I think it was 2.08 billion of the estimated costs. I think it's important to note here, the cost and the contract value. So the contract value for that amount will not be that same amount, and there's a few reasons for that. I referenced, on a base level, of course, an agency might not spend that full amount. That's its maximum. That's what their maximum they could spend. But also, if there's a leverage contract, all right, so you have a contract where this is what I need to do, but I don't have the scope, I don't have the money in there to do it, I need to amend it. I need to add that to it. So if we add the entire max to that number, you're going to be capturing a lot of things. So that number that George was able to provide from OMB, I think, is by far the most accurate number in terms of our costs right now. In terms of contract value, I find it both under-inclusive and over-inclusive because it's both failing to capture and capturing more than it should. So I would defer to the number that George testified to.
Okay, thank you. And how many of these contracts are with for-profit vendors?
I don't have that exact data before me, Councilmember. I'd be happy to follow up on the exact amount. I would note, I think as Commissioner Park spoke about 127 of these are around there are with DSS. Now, of course, so I think that gives you a good example. DSS, their program is based with nonprofits. So the vast majority of these contracts are through DSS. I don't have an exact number on the business organization type, but I think that's a helpful guide.
So it's about 127?
It's certainly over half. I'll have to get back to you with specific numbers.
Okay, and so why were for-profit vendors without experience selected versus those vendors who have experience running shelters?
So in terms of any contract decisions, I'll turn it over to the procuring agencies.
So let me just clarify. I think we may have flipped the numbers there. The 127 that were referenced, those are DSS contracts, and those are almost exclusively with not-for-profits. So I couldn't hear. It sounded like maybe we were interpreting the 127 as
so we can assume the rest are for-profits?
No, not necessarily. I think we're as Charles said, we'll get back to you on the split, but I just wanted to clarify that the DSS contracts are largely with nonprofits. With the for-profit contracts sort of across the board, there's going to be a mix of vendors that are doing exactly the work that is squarely within their wheelhouse, right? So if we are contracting, these actually probably are not in the number because we're leveraging our existing contracts, but we have 3 contracts with food vendors. They're for-profits, right? They're companies that provide bulk meals. That is exactly what they do. It's what they've done for us for many years. They are for-profit companies. In other cases, there are instances where we're working with organizations that have stepped outside a little bit because we are working in such an unprecedented space. But I'll let my colleagues chime in.
Yeah, just, from HPD's perspective, we have contracted with for-profit companies that just have an expertise that we needed based on the programmatic objectives that we needed to achieve, So for the kind of upstate program, it is a program where we...
the expertise to service migrant communities?
Yeah, the expertise to stand up shelters quickly in places that we've never been, And so with DocGo, they have this expertise, this like logistical expertise, this ability to mobilize quickly, hire staff quickly, stand up an operation in a short amount of time. And then they subcontract with a bunch of different entities. Some of them are for-profit, to Commissioner Park's point. Our food vendors are often for-profit, the security firms are for-profit, the laundry firms are for-profit. But a lot of the case management and social work are subcontracted to nonprofits.
Okay, thank you. And speaking of DocGo, can you just tell us what were the specific reasons or criteria that led to the selection of DocGo specifically?
Sure. So we selected DocGo because they have this experience that we know about because, they are a contractor for the city of New York, particularly H&H, as Dr. Long mentioned earlier, that's done a lot of this type of work in the past where, for test and trace, for setting up, essentially vaccination centers, for setting up testing centers, for doing all that and pushing into various different communities, hiring a bunch of people and operating very quickly and mobilizing. They have a history with us doing that. So we were familiar with them operationally. So when we reached out to them, that's why we reached out to them for this specific objective upstate.
And so were any alternative providers considered?
Yeah, so at the moment when we contracted with DocGo, this is again back in spring 2023, we reached out to our sister agencies to figure out who's able to do this work in New York City and upstate, right? So we met a lot of different entities very quickly in a matter of days that provide a lot of these services. From the DHS folks that do this type of work, we're all kind of tapped out, They were at capacity. These are a lot of the nonprofit providers that Commissioner Park told you about a little moment ago. And we reached out to H&H as well, and they had a few vendors that they were working with. We met a lot of them, tried to understand what they're capable of doing and when they're able to do it, what kind of capacity they had. And so we chose DocGo through that process.
We're going to go to the next council member. Do you have more questions? Or?
Yeah.
Quickly, go ahead, because we're trying to be fair, but
I think
one more.
Chairwoman, Councilmember Yeager gave me 2 minutes of his time.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you just tell us what type of services are provided by the DocGo contract?
Can I start with that? I think you're getting an important point. I just wanted to clarify in terms of how we use our vendors at our H&H sites. So we, again, break down the different services we have. One service is intake. You need to have somebody to check in people as they're arriving. Food, security, laundry, cleaning the rooms, medical, a variety of things. And we use DocGo to provide intake and some services like that, but I just wanted to, because I don't think I've said it so far in the hearing, DocGo is not the only vendor that we use to provide those services. We have other vendors like MedRight that are able to scale to the capacity that we need them to, at the speed that we need them to, and provide services that they've shown that they are able to provide at our site with our oversight. So I just wanted I didn't want to leave the impression that DocGo, for example, across our city sites was the only vendor providing these types of specific services.
Okay, thank you. So can you just clarify what services are provided by the DocGo contract specifically?
So for the DocGo contract with HPD specifically for the upstate hoteling program, I'll rattle off those services. So they're the exact same services that we provide at our HERCs down here in New York City. So they're required to provide shelter, food, laundry, case management, and social work. So the exact same services that are provided here are provided up there. So like I mentioned, they subcontract a lot of that work to folks that have that expertise in the communities where they set up shop.
So how much is spent on shelter?
So shelter is probably one of our largest services. Give me 1 second to see if we have that breakdown. Can I follow up with you on that? It is our largest line item, though.
Yes, and how about on food?
Sorry?
How about on food?
I will follow up with you on each line item after this hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Add the bus to it, too.
The bus? Sorry, so the transportation is part of the DocGo
I know.
suite of services, and what we've actually done over the last month, we've heard a lot of feedback from our upstate partners about clients who are trying to get to appointments, legal service appointments, medical appointments, and are using the DocGo shuttles, right? And the way the shuttles work in some of our upstate communities, they do big loops, you know, and sometimes the loops take 2 to 3 hours. So you could be done with a medical appointment in 30 minutes, and you're waiting for the same shuttle to take you back home, right? So what we've done now is we've switched from the shuttle service to more of a metro transit service. So what we're doing in our upstate communities like Albany, Rochester, Buffalo, we're giving our asylum seekers metro cards, bus passes.
They hardly have buses that come any faster than the shuttles that you just described.
Well, there's predictability at least to
Okay.
it. There's a
All right.
schedule, and they can choose when they come, and they
When
can
was the
choose
last
when they
time
can
you were
go.
in Rochester?
When was the last time I was in
I'm just
Rochester?
saying. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Ariola?
Thank you, chairs. Thank you all for testifying today. Before Commissioner Isco left, he mentioned that DocGo was registered, and he said it was registered and filed with the Comptroller's Office. Was there also discussion with the Comptroller's Office prior to that registration and filing?
So before, like, we had to actually check in with the comptroller's office before we could move forward with the contract, period, right? And so we got a letter from the comptroller. He had some concerns. We responded to that letter and addressed his concerns in a letter from my commissioner to the comptroller. And we're obviously going to have a very close relationship with the comptroller over the next few months, you know, as he audits this contract.
Thank you. Mr. Blanco, so we've talked a lot about contracts that are failing, but I'm sure there are other contracts that are very successful. Would you like to speak to those contracts and what measures NISM has put in place so they can better assess when awarding contracts?
Sure, thank you for your question, council member. It might be helpful for us to maybe just take a step back and talk about sort of the respite center operation that NISM runs, which is, I think, vastly different than the HERCS and the others, DHS and HPD systems. So when we're talking about the respite centers, we're really talking about the sort of short-term sheltering operation at various places throughout the city. You know, NISM is responsible for providing rent. It's really providing a roof and 3 meals a day to folks. So really the basic services that folks need to survive. So again, rent, we provide staffing for all of the sites in conjunction with H&H. So that provides security, fire guards, front-end staffing for intake. We provide all the supplies and equipment for the initial setup of the sites, right? And so that's anywhere from cots to snacks to any sort of hygiene needs that folks need, soap, shampoo, et cetera. We also provide work around basic cleaning and maintenance of the facilities. And so as folks can imagine, for a lot of these sites, a lot of them are maybe not in the best state of repair. And so there's constant need to sort of clean up as well as to maintain the facilities. I think, again, we have a lot of success as far as the vendors that are providing services at our sites. Again, we have constant check-ins with our partners here at this table, right, because it is a whole city approach. We're utilizing both our vendors as well as H&H's vendors for a variety of the services. I think we have 2 daily site check-ins, one in the morning and one in the evening. We have a agency leadership check-in at first thing in the morning after the site check-ins. And so with regards to the vendors that we've had at our sites through H&H's contracts, for instance, Rethink and Long Island Com, who does food services, we've had a very sort of strong track record of success. They've been delivering high-quality food services. They've responsive to any sort of our needs and concerns. As we said before, like, we take all of our incident reports very seriously. We're monitoring constantly all of our vendors. We have regular check-ins with all of our vendors as well as with H&H, who oversees a large number of our contracts. And so, yeah, I mean, I think with regards to just the performance of the vendors at our sites, again, like, strong track record in providing security services in food, as well as just, again, a lot of the work that's being done to just maintain the facilities. A lot of cleaning, a lot of work that's being done to repair plumbing and heating and all sorts of issues.
Mr.
Councilmember,
Blanco,
oh, sorry.
Mr. Blanco, we were told that a lot of the respite centers will be closing down. How many respite centers across the city will be closing down?
I don't have that figure right now. What I can say is I think at our peak we were at 16 respite centers. I think currently we're at 12. We closed the 2 sites recently at the McCarran Park Recreation Center and Sunset Park. Again, we're evaluating the entire system as a whole to understand sort of which are the most efficient, which are the least efficient. I think particularly as we stand up additional sites, whether that's through HERCs, whether it's through these new sites from the federal government, it's really going to be dependent upon how the system the needs sort of grow throughout the system, right? As folks have been aware, there's been a huge increase in the last few weeks of the folks that we're seeing. I think there was an article yesterday about the number of folks that crossed the border, and we anticipate that to increase the number of folks that we're receiving. So it's really going to be dependent upon what we're seeing as far as arrivals, as well as the other expansions and contractions throughout the system.
And out of your sites, how are you evaluating which ones to shut down?
We're working with City Hall to sort of understand costs throughout all of our systems. And so working closely with OMB and the Office of Asylum Seekers, we're working to just understand, what are the needs that we're seeing. I think particularly as with regards to our systems, right, as I mentioned before, it's fairly bare bones. I think with regards to the changing of seasons, that's a big concern for us, preparing for winter. And so viability for us is looking at what are the new needs that are emerging every day as we're seeing the change in season, the change in arrivals, just the change in the needs of the populations that we're serving.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to...
Just no, I really hadn't finished my questioning. I'm sorry, chairs.
We're going to come back because we have second rounds for folks.
No, but this was still part of my first round. It just kind of got hijacked.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have a question. So there's been a lot of discussion about the lease signing at Floyd Bennett Field. What is the plan that you have for services and those services that would be contracted, and who would they be contracted to if that particular site opens as a center for however many single men migrants?
We're still evaluating that. I know it's a big site that's currently under discussion with the federal government. So currently evaluating what works best at that site and for that neighborhood.
So there's no plan in place right now? We're still evaluating?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Aviles?
Thank you, chairs. Oops, pardon me. Thank you all for your work and testimony. I'd like to know, Commissioner, you mentioned, Commissioner, for our DSS, Commissioner, you mentioned a standard policy of notifying council members. Can you articulate what that policy actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a typical DHS site, we notify at least 30 days, but I think the average is actually more like 200 days. That is for a standard, 9-year or longer contracted site. For these emergency sites, we are notifying as quickly as we possibly can. There have absolutely been some instances where it is day of, and I know there was at least one phone call I made to council member who's not here, but where I called him personally to say the bus is on its way. And I hate doing that, but we have been in really urgent and emergency situations. It's a process over the last year that we have really struggled to keep up with, given the pace of the openings. It's now that it is a whole of government effort, it is more predictable, but early on, and when DHS was the lead, there were days or weeks where we were opening 4, 5, 6 sites. And I will, to the extent that we drop the ball, I will own that, and certainly happy to follow up on any particulars.
Sure. So just for clarification, for a typical site, at least 30 days prior to its opening?
Correct.
And
but
200 days?
Is more like average.
It's more like average?
Yeah.
Okay.
We will notify, generally notify on a site, as soon as we are through the procurement process, and given the fact that most of our typical sites involve construction, we will notify as soon as we possibly can.
Got it. And so in my short tenure, I've never experienced any of these. Certainly I just discovered a new facility in our district that I had no idea about. In fact, my most reliable information source are the residents on the block who see the activity of moving in supplies into a building, of when shelters are being opened. And I understand this has been an emergency and we're working better at it. But even most recently, we discovered a new facility in the district that your staff didn't even have information about. So I'm gonna get there. Again, there is certainly grace here because we are operating under constraints, but this has been an ongoing issue that opening up a facility doesn't happen within 24 hours, right? For all intents and purposes, the agencies are inspecting these facilities to make sure they meet certain standards, they're moving things in, they're gathering supply. It doesn't happen in 15, a day. And so I just have to appeal for increased courtesy to collaborate with us so that we can support. Because our community has received all manner and has many facilities in it. And we have wanted to support, but we're constantly at the back end playing defense and trying to make something out of nothing.
Okay. First, let me just start by really thanking you for your understanding at the unusual set of circumstances. I think we should touch base offline and make sure that that DSS has all of the most appropriate communication. Maybe it is something as simple as not having the right phone number, right email address. I would also say, there are multiple agencies here, obviously, opening sites, so we should also just make sure that we, as a team, are consistently notifying. Because DHS does have a large shelter footprint, we do have protocols that are maybe a little bit newer to some of our sister agencies.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some sharing of challenges. But in terms of the food you mentioned, and the reason why I'm directing it to you, Commissioner, is because most of the facilities in my district are run under your agency purview. In terms of the food, most recently we've received pictures of boxes of Cheez-Its and the peaches in the syrup, and people saying that they have received a care package of tuna fish and crackers, which is supposed to be their meals for the days. This is, yeah. I'd like to know how do we confuse that with 3 meals a day?
Sure. So I think this is a reflection of the various models of sheltering that we have going on in the face of this emergency. And I'll start, and George can chime in. So in some of the points of time where we have really been at peak capacity, we as a city have placed some families in scatter site hotel rooms. So rather than in sort of the typical model that we've been talking about, the city, whichever agency is lead, has bought out the entire hotel. There is, security at the front door. There is sort of organized structure. There have been instances where, because we have simply hit a wall, and we have actually just placed a family in a hotel room. So there's maybe, in a 100-unit hotel, there's 4 rooms that are being used. This is a hypothetical example, right? But 4 rooms being used for a client. In that case, they are getting, we want to make sure, we understand people have very limited resources. They're getting shelf-stable food so that they are able, those are short-term placements, and if somebody, if they reach the end of that and still have an ongoing need, they'll be moved to something that is more stable. Okay. In the DHS facilities where we have bought out the entire hotel, we are providing 3 meals a day.
I'm not sure that's the case in a facility in my district, where the Cheez-Its were good the first 2 days, and then the families were like, okay, enough with the Cheez-Its.
Let's compare addresses, because
let's
there is
look
this
into
model with the box of shelf-stable food, but
last question, thank you. We'll look into it. This morning, we had another facility in my district who family members stumbled upon a local service provider. They didn't know where they really were, and there are no services at the facility. No telling them where they are, where they can get access to anything. And so I'd love to follow up with you on the facility in Red Hook and this facility Phoenix on 39th Street in Sunset Park, among others. Thank you.
Absolutely, let's follow up off the line.
Thank you very much. Some larger question. Can you explain what checks and balances are absent from the emergency procurement process versus the traditional procurement that makes it so much faster to do the emergency? I think that's kind of the overall policy question that maybe you're trying to answer, we're trying to answer. We want nonprofit, we want less expensive, and we want high quality. I think we all want that, but maybe we get it at different ways. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So thank you, Chair Brewer. In terms of the overall structure of comparing an emergency procurement to a standard procurement, I know as Director Flores had testified previously on separate council hearings about the differences between the two, it essentially comes down to timing. The standards are going to remain the same in terms of vendor integrity, in terms of vendor responsibility. In terms of competition and evaluation, I think the biggest difference we can say is if you use a CSB, a bid, an RFP, if you use any of these other methods, it's going to tell you exactly how you have to select and evaluate, whereas in emergency procurement, it's much more contextual. It's about the idea of using as much competition as is possible and practicable. So I think the major difference is in it gives an agency the flexibility to meet the emergency in that different ways. We've shown, so DSS has a very specific way, which is very similar to its normal way, and it's kind of using it and just saying, okay, great, I can use that and go ahead. That's not going to be the case for others. So I'd say systemically, where you're going to gain time in particular is the fact that a contract is considered effective long before the period that we would say filing or registration in a normal contract. So it's a combination of timing and kind of a much more contextual analysis.
I guess that's why DocGo got selected, but I have to say, if that's the answer, then we should be working with our nonprofits in the city of New York to get them. United Neighborhood Houses is huge. They can handle this. I'm just saying. I know they can. They're multi-million-dollar. So as time goes on, thinking proactively, God forbid there's another, some kind of crisis, stick to our own and to the nonprofit community and have them prepared for whatever you think is the faster way.
Absolutely. And Chair, I would add, kind of picking up on an earlier moment about moving away from emergency contracts, I would like to make it clear, it is absolutely the city's
Yeah, but it hasn't
policy to
happened
move
yet.
away.
I see some 2.6s out there, like 2.6.
Completely, but we're constantly looking, every contracting situation, saying where can we make this the most competitive possible.
Okay, a question for Dr. Long. So I like that checkbook thing that the controller has. I remember when it started, but you don't use it. So because you are not a city agency. So how do we keep track of you as your contracts without checkbook? What is our method for being as transparent as checkbook?
Well, I'm not familiar.
We can't just call you. You don't know checkbook?
I'm not familiar with checkbook, but
Everybody else is familiar with checkbook except for you.
I'm just a primary care doctor.
Yeah. Please give me a break.
But I will say, and I know the comptroller can correct me when he testifies, but I believe all of our contracts.
Can you explain to him at some point what checkbook is?
Maybe
Thank you.
afterwards, Brad.
I was there when it started, of course.
You
Go
were.
ahead. Yes, I was there when everything started.
I
Go ahead.
believe at this point that all of our contracts have been through City Hall shared now with the comptroller's office. So going forward, would look forward to following up more about that.
Okay, because it's not transparent, just FYI. The other question I have for, just going back to HPD and the worship faith-based, how many are actually up and running? Maybe you told us this, but I don't remember.
2.
Just 2?
2 in the Bronx.
Out of 50?
50 is the goal.
So what's the timing? How's that going to work?
It's slower than you'd like.
No, I know it's slow.
And we have a couple more that are in the queue for the next couple weeks. They will be ready when we feel like they're safe.
All right, we'll talk about that later.
I'm
The other thing is the unions are or not participating in building these big tents. What's going on with the unions and the tents? I think that's for you. Unions and tents and construction. Are you using union labor?
So NISM is not holding the contract for the tents as of now. Like, as we mentioned, it's still very much under discussion, but we'd be happy to follow up with.
What's that thing in Randall's Island if it's not a tent?
That's not a NISM contract. We're
Okay.
happy to follow up with DCAS, who holds the Garner contract, and follow up with you.
Anybody know about this contract? No. There's a little problem with silos. You heard of silos? Okay, I'm just saying, all right, so you don't know anything about it. All right, go ahead.
For the places of faith, we're seeing reports all throughout the city of places of faith that are housing migrants, and you're stating that there's only 2 contracts out there. Can you explain what's going on? Because they're clearly being bussed by Moya and other city agencies to these places of faith.
Yeah, so the 2 that I'm talking about are the 2 that we've contracted with. Sometimes houses of worship, do their own independent thing where they reach out and help asylum seekers. This is like a city contract, and that's why we're trying to make it safe and work out well. And give the houses of worship the support they need, quite frankly, to do this.
So are the places of worship that are currently housing migrants going to get a contract?
So if there are other houses of worship other than the 2 I mentioned that you know about, just let me know and we'll reach out to them and get a sense of what's happening there.
Okay. My next question, before I go to my next question, this is for Mox. We receive some emergency contract notifications, but they often go to a variety of different people in the council. Can you direct ACCOs at your agencies to send contract notification to council, finance, and the speaker's leadership team? So we are unable to track all of them because it's being sent to different people. The people that the speaker's team would like it to be sent to are Richard Lee, which is the finance director for council, Jonathan Rosenberg, and Florentine Kabor. And we can get you those emails as well through Alex. And going back to MWBEs, what guidance has the administration issued to agencies and contractors regarding standards and best practices for contracting with MWBEs during emergency situations?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Chair Wan. So as it comes to the city's policy regarding emergency procurements and MWBEs, I would note the relatively recent now, Executive Order 36 regarding one of the aspects of it was directing city agencies to ensure that when possible that they are getting at least one bid, proposal, or quote from MWBEs. It's something that this administration takes very seriously. In this building, every Monday, we have a very specific meeting with our procuring agencies about MWBE procurement and how we maximize the equity of our response. I think we saw in many emergency scenarios that can fall by the wayside, and that's something that we take very, very seriously. I would note, again, as we talk about the proportions of types of organizations we're contracting with, nonprofits are not MWBEs by the definitions. So of course there's, it's imbalancing the desire to work with CBOs and the desire to work with city-certified MWBEs. It's something that we take very seriously.
Do you know what percentage are MWBEs currently?
Specifically, I'd be happy to get back to you. I don't have the data in front of me as to how many a percentage of our contractors would be or a percentage of that contract value, but I'd be happy to follow up with your office.
Okay, we'll follow up on that, Alex. And then, Molly, could you repeat for us one more time the number of nonprofit contracts so that we could calculate that as something that can't be certified as MWBEs in our calculations?
Sure. So just to clarify, I think we need to get back to you on the exact number of not-for-profit contracts. Of the 205 that Charles mentioned, 127 are DHS contracts, and so we're, virtually all of those are with not-for-profit organizations, but that is indicative. It's not the final answer, and we'll circle back.
Okay, thank you. And for DHS, per passport, there's a pending amendment to HANIC, the Hotel Associations Foundation's contract with DHS to amend the contract from $237 million to $1.365 billion and through August 2026. Can you help us understand why did DHS deem it necessary to hire intermediary to source space for asylum seekers, especially to renew it now or to extend the contract when you know that you've been at full capacity and you have sourced every single hotel possible?
Sure. So the HANIC is the primary role that they are playing is as a fiscal agent and not as a sourcing agent. They do help with the sourcing, but the primary role is that the payments to the hotels themselves are passing through HANIC. And we do that so that it takes it off of the not-for-profit contract, right? So that the not-for-profit doesn't have the responsibility and the financial liability of dealing with the hotel. It smooths the process for us as an administration. We are working really hard to make sure that we are providing quality services with more or less to a population that is 70%, 80% larger than it was 18 months ago, and our staff is certainly not 80% larger. So by working with a fiscal agent where we are managing the HANOC contract and they are managing the individual payments to the hotels, it's a really efficient way for us to do business and make sure that we aren't putting too much obligation on our not-for-profit partners. So we are extending the bulk of the vast majority of the dollars in that contract are passed through rent payments to the hotels. Although we hope not to grow our hotel footprint anymore, I'm never gonna say never, because this has been such a challenging window, but certainly we have dramatically slowed the pace of our growth of our hotel footprint, but we also know it will take some time to transition to other kinds of shelters, so we are extending those hotel contracts. We want to do it one time rather than doing it year by year so that we have some predictability. It helps us manage our contracting workload, and there are cancellation clauses in every contract, both with the individual hotels and with HANOC, so that if we turns out we don't need the capacity, we can stop.
Why was this contract not publicly bid?
HANOC also responded through our RFP.
So you're saying that it was publicly bid?
Correct.
Thank you.
Just about Arrow, back to Arrow. Sometimes it's Mulligan Security and Arrow. Why are they at the same facility? And then second, who determines how many people in terms of security are necessary at a particular facility? And also finally, they are making, at least from my calculation, sometimes $72,000 a year. Is that normal for a security officer at this level?
So, great questions. In terms of I'll talk about, just take a couple notes here, the cost, and then how we determine the number needed, and then about
Mulligan.
Arrow versus Mulligan. So in terms of the costs, we can get back to you with more precise numbers about the cost that we're paying the security vendors for the guards they're providing. I will note the numbers you're using might be from when Garner was subcontracting with Mulligan earlier on in the crisis. Since then, we've sought to reduce costs, so the number may be different, and I think is different today, so that's what I could circle back with you about. In terms of the number needed, we do walkthroughs with the NYPD. We look at, depending on the number of entrances and exits, and depending on the number of floors and the unique layout of each site, we determine together what the need in terms of the number of guards would be, and that's how many guards we have at each site. In terms of Arrow versus Mulligan, our intention is to have one vendor per site. I would love the example, which we can look into afterwards, about if maybe it could have been this special circumstance or something like that. But then, of course, going forward, our ability to reduce cost is the most important thing we're doing is, again, the competitive RFP to introduce competition for cost effectiveness and quality into the process. That RFP is closed, and we look forward to evaluating the results of that as soon as we can.
I don't think you need as many people. I would like to see, I saw at the bottom, if I remember correctly, for like the ESL contract, the OSHA contract, services to get you back at work kind of contracts, $25,000 each, compared to the monumental millions. So that's wrong. In other words, why are we not using our opportunities to spend money to get people to work? Now, of course, thank goodness for Tom Perez and everybody else in the White House for thinking that they can pull off, hopefully, some TPS. But it's just crazy for me to be spending money on Arrow, DACO, et cetera, and not for the nonprofits to get people back to work. Can somebody comment on that? That's what we need. What do they want? They want jobs, they want to learn English, they want training, et cetera. But we're spending money on guards, and I don't know about these caseworkers at DACO. Can somebody answer this, why we're not spending more money on these other kinds of services? It said 25,000 on my list.
Well, I can start with just a couple of thoughts. And actually, this goes back to Councilmember Ariola's question in terms of what does success look like so far? And I'll give a concrete example. One aspect of success to me is that we've had 24,000 casework encounters with our asylum seekers. I am a true believer in case management. I view that in primary care, my medical roles, I'm a medical case manager. I think that needs to be the backbone of our response going forward, and we do use our vendors to provide for us people that provide that service. The reason case management is so important is people are at different stages of the process of seeking asylum, of work authorization. We're soon going to know exactly how many people fall into each bucket and have targeted legal outreach, targeted outreach for those that would qualify for resettlement programs. That's going to be a game changer in my mind. So I do just want to defend the casework and case management. I do think is a really important part of the process. That is not in any way intended to say that I don't agree with you about the importance of nonprofits, which I'll see if anybody else wants to weigh in on.
Sure, like particularly for some of our upstate locations, we partner with nonprofits that have actually, particularly in the Erie County case, that have actually been serving refugees and asylum seekers for years. Those are the folks.
I know them. I know the.
Yeah, and they do great work, and they care deeply, and they're engaging our folks, trying to help them down the road, connecting them to legal service providers, connecting them to potentially the next need their child might have, an ESL program. I mean,
It's just not happening here in the hotels that I'm in and out of. There's no ESL, a little bit, but not enough. 5. And there isn't enough OSHA, et cetera, et cetera.
I think, Councilmember, that we absolutely are addressing a hierarchy of needs, right? Getting people sheltered, fed, and safe, connecting to the very basic health care, initial key health care that Dr. Long mentioned. Those have been the focus, which is not to say that the other pieces are not important, and we're working. There are a lot of agencies that aren't at the table here because they aren't necessarily the leads, but have been providing really amazing work. We're partnering with DYCD. We're partnering with ACS, has been able to connect families to services as well. We continue to look for ways that we can expand what we're doing, but at the end of the day, we keep coming back to our touch points. Are people sheltered, fed, safe, access to medical care?
I mean, there may be a disagreement with that, but I appreciate what you're saying.
I just want to put on the record to return to what we were talking about for HANIC. Per passport and checkbook, HANIC was an emergency contract. It was not traditional sealed competitive bidding through normal procurement process. We saw a letter in OASIS for the bid, which seemed to be written with HANIC in mind. We are curious about how many other entities bidded for that contract. Could you share that?
So I will certainly follow up after the fact. My understanding is that they did bid through the sanctuary RFP that we put out, right? So it was an emergency RFP, but it was a competitive process. I don't know that anybody bid for exactly the same suite of services. It is a somewhat unusual function, but again, I can certainly follow up with more specific details after that.
Thank you. And to follow up to what Councilmember Brewer was sharing, for the caseworkers, I agree with Dr. Long. They're incredibly important, but I want to make sure that it's on public record that according to the DACO contract, they're supposed to be 24 hours a day, $75 per hour, which means that if you are working 7-hour days per week for 5 days, that the caseworker for DACO gets $126,000. Whereas the average pay for a caseworker in New York City is $55,289. I don't know for the H&H contract, the caseworkers have a different pay scale. Do you know off the top of your head?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay, we'll follow up on that. My last few questions is about the unions for MOCs. Has the agency been ensuring that emergency contractors are complying with labor standards and applicable labor law?
So, Councilmember or Chair Wan, agencies are required to comply with that labor law, regardless of the use of an emergency procurement or not, per se. Right? It's going to depend on the characteristics of that work-related law. So we have done so. I would say I know that unions have come to us before and said, "Hey, we're concerned about some programming decision." As you know, that's not MOCS's traditional role. However, when we do hear that, we are constantly in communication with agencies, with City Hall about instances where that's happened. And if unions have those concerns, we've communicated them. Although, as you know, we don't approve emergency procurements in the same way that we normally would.
Okay, and then for the other agencies, I know that for HPD, we have contractors rebuilding Austell Place, for example, in my district. Are we aware of any vendors selected from unionized companies? Are these contracts subject to prevailing wage requirements? And are agencies auditing to ensure that prevailing wage is enforced where applicable? And have any violations been identified?
Yeah, let me get back to you, council member. We'll figure out who the folks were, what they were doing, how much they were getting paid, if there were any violations for Austell.
Okay, we'll follow up for HPD and NISM and DCAS, it sounds like. Okay, we're gonna go through 1 minute of lightning round questions because we do have to go to the controller. We have a hard stop at 4. We're gonna do 1 minute for Councilmember Areola.
Thank you. Dr. Long, this is for you. I know we put a lot of emphasis on children and vaccinations and such, but what are the protocols for adults coming in to get vaccinations? And also, how many who have been at the intake center or at any of our respite sites have had any type of communicable diseases? And when they are diagnosed with such, what protocol is in place for treating and quarantine?
Great questions. In terms of, I'll start with the isolation protocols and talk about vaccines among adults and children. So the isolation protocols are when we screen for communicable diseases up front at the arrival center. It's the first thing we do. We immediately isolate you in a private room that is safe, and we have a medical team on there that will attend to any needs you have. And then you'll spend the duration of your isolation time, which is the time you're contagious, depending on what communicable disease you might have, in one of our isolation rooms in a hotel. When you no longer need that room, you then leave the hotel. So you're kept safe the whole time, and we attend to your medical care as well. Excuse me. With respect to vaccinations for adults and children, just to be totally honest, we're providing a tremendous number of vaccinations for both. The way it should be done is, in my mind, people should be getting vaccinated in Texas before they come to New York City. They're unvaccinated, potentially at risk of contracting or transmitting communicable diseases their whole journey up here. Sometimes this is not the first place that they go, in which case they haven't been vaccinated there for a longer amount of time before coming to New York City. Here, we do the best we can, which is immediately when you're doing intake, we offer you all of the vaccines to bring you up to speed that we can. We've done so many vaccines. We've, working with the Department of Health, we nearly exhausted their supply. They had to order more. Again, 37,000 total so far. It just speaks to the tremendous need. And again, if more was done in Texas, we wouldn't have to do as much here. We end up catching up and doing the work that people need to have done because vaccines, in my mind, are a human right. But they haven't had the opportunity, including in Texas, until they get here.
I just also want to put on the record that Floating Hospital, a clinic in my district, has let us know that to enter DOE schools, as you just testified, children require multiple visits to catch them up on vaccinations or do blood work to screen for immunity and preventable diseases. And the Floating Hospital has received referrals and requests from DOHMH, DOE, individual shelters, Queen CBOs, for asylum seekers to provide these vaccinations. So we're going to continue to follow up to track exactly which shelters in my district are continuing to shuffle them to this small clinic. We're going to go to our last 2 questions, Holden and then Councilmember Williams.
Thank you. Lightning round. So, .go contract. How many subcontractors, because you mentioned before when I was questioning you that most of the problems that were published were subcontractor problems. How many did .go use?
So .go is using 15 subcontractors, and 2 of them were the
Two of the problem. Who's responsible when that happens? By the way, do we get a list of subcontractors before you sign the contract?
Yes, we do.
Okay, and you vet the subcontractors?
They do the vetting of the subcontractors.
They did it?
Yes, they're there.
Okay, so in the end, who's responsible for that?
Well, we're responsible for the work, right? And that's why we talk to them every day and make sure that if there's a problem with the subcontractor, we're directing them on how to make the change.
But so when you find a subcontractor did that, do you not use the subcontractor anymore? Do you say they're barred?
I mean, like, we're talking about
they were the
subcontractor
problem.
in Albany,
No,
like we're not going to use another security company in Albany.
Okay, let's say the transportation subcontractor just dropped somebody off, migrants off somewhere in no man's land, right? You found out they did that.
No, that's wrong. They dropped them off where they were supposed to go. It just took them another 2.5 hours to come back to pick them up, and they were waiting for about an hour and a half.
The controller has to leave, so we have to move on, but then we'll come back.
I'm sorry.
Councilmember Williams?
Thank you. Just a few questions. So will H&H, I know because of your structure, you have a more corporate structure, which doesn't allow for as much transparency. Just wondering if you plan to give greater transparency around some of the lump sum payments and what subcontractors are making. The next question is about MWBEs and debundling contracts. I know the whole idea is to make it expedient, and when you start debundling it causes confusion, but just wondering if there have been any thoughts about how to break out some of these contracts for MWBEs to be awarded. And I was just wondering if the folks who have been contracted have been subjected to the state mandate to contract out 30% MWBEs. And if, when you write the RFPs, if you're creating any criteria or incentives within the RFP for these larger companies to subcontract with MWBEs. And then last but not least, just listening to the conversation about the securities, I'm almost done, the conversation about the security hourly wages. I'm pretty sure they're not making $75 an hour, because I know companies typically do indirect cost rates. And so wondering what percentage you all have allowed them to bill for the indirect cost rate, because a person could technically be making $13 an hour and the rest of that $75 an hour actually benefits and goes to the company. So thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I'll get started and then I'll try to be fast. So in terms of our contracts first, I believe, and our comptroller can confirm this in a bit, that we've now shared all of our contracts through City Hall with the comptroller's office. In terms of pay, just to give the statistics, so we said that we've spent as a city $2.08 billion thus to date in the crisis. H&H's share of that is $743 million, and that's the amount expended with the denominator of $2.08 billion. In terms of MWBE criteria, we set the 30% goal for all of our contractors as appropriate, and it's part of the criteria through the RFP process that we use as well. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we've just gone through we're going through the RFP process for 3 different aspects or service lines of work right now. So that will be coming up shortly.
And you are like making sure they are complying with the 30% MWBE? Okay.
We do closely monitor that, yes. And then on the indirect, I'll have to follow up with you about that. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
On the DSS side, because the majority of our contracts are with human service providers, that they aren't MWBEs, but we are actively pushing them to use MWBE subs. As Charles said, this is something where there's a weekly meeting on it to make sure that we are moving that, but it does mean that it is bundled the way that you initially pointed out. I would also note that anything that is federally funded, the sort of speedy MWBE procurement methodology, we're capped at $250,000, unlike the city where we can go up to, I think, $1 million and a half. So that's something that I think many of us have on our federal legislative agenda. We'd like to see that higher so that we can do more MWBE procurement.
And briefly, Councilmember, I would note for the debundling question and the subcontracting question, as the Commissioner said, under the leadership of Chief Business Diversity Officer Michael Garner, there are meetings at a minimum weekly, but many times a week regarding how can we strategically look at this portfolio and maximize equity. It is of crucial importance. And again, those subcontracting amounts, I believe H&H's food RFP was actually 35%, and constantly pushing the envelope whenever we can.
And for HPD, we have about 4 different prime contracts, so it is a subcontracting question that we're trying to solve for too. We're talking to our folks regularly in the upstate communities. They're actually trying to get to know folks. It's a little different because you're going to Schenectady and don't really know who the folks are in Schenectady. So at first you're trying to stand up an operation and do it quickly, and then after that you're trying to understand who are the food folks that we can contract with, right? And are they able to essentially provide 600 meals a day for these 200 people that are in a hotel? And it's not a large universe of vendors that can actually do that. And so that you're also trying to do is find out, do they provide culturally appropriate food, and are they an MWBE, right? So you're trying to find that sweet spot. But it's stuff we talk about every day when we're trying to nail down who our vendors actually are.
And finally, for NISM, I mean, for our respite centers, all of the contracts that we have that we've done for emergency procurements, except for the laundry vendor, has been an MWBE. The laundry vendor is subcontracting a number of MWBEs. And again, these are for the emergency contracts. We also are obviously utilizing our requirements contracts from DCAS and other agencies that we're required to do so.
Everybody's okay? Thank you very much, panel. We look forward to nonprofits. We look forward to New York City vendors, and we look forward to no emergency contracts and regular vending. And if you want help doing that, we're available. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we'll hear from our controller, Brad Lander. Mr. Controller, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to swear in the controller, Councilmember, if that's all right. Controller Lander, would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony today, and to respond honestly to councilmember questions?
I do.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Brewer and Chair Wan and other members of the council for this important hearing on the scores of contracts, now the hundreds of contracts the city agencies have entered into to provide shelter and services for more than 100,000 people seeking asylum who've arrived in New York City over the past 14 months. And I want to emphasize the importance and the value of this hearing. Dr. Long is correct, for example, that H&H has now given us their contracts. We started asking for them last winter. I think it was December, it might have been January. They arrived this week. So the hearing, I think, in addition to continued asking, has helped prompt good progress. And in many ways, that's what we want to do here, 1 year on. And a bit more from the start of this is to really interrogate where are we and what can we be doing to make sure we're getting the best value for the resources we're spending. The Comptroller's Office monitors emergency contracting and spending as carefully as we possibly can. And I'm not going to read everything in here. You can go through it as well. But I think it's important to just underline a couple of things. The primary thing that emergency contracting exempts agencies from is to do a competitive sealed bid or an RFP or a cost competitive proposal. They can, as you've heard, but they're not required to. And of course, in some cases, doing a bid, doing an RFP can take a long time and would prevent you from moving as quickly as you need to. But you don't get as good a cost when you don't bid a contract. And that is what we're really trying to balance here. It's also worth noting that both the charter and the PPB rules refer to unforeseen situations. And so this remains a situation for which flexibility and urgency are needed, but the situation is no longer unforeseen. And so how do we use what we know a year in to make sure we're providing the best possible services at the best possible price with effective contractors? And of course, things keep changing. TPS changed last night, so that'll shift how the Asylum Seeker Application Center is providing legal services. And of course, flexibility is needed, but there are more ways to make sure we move to more cost competitive and more effective methods. And one other thing I just want to mention, because you got to it at the end, MWBE rules are no longer categorically exempted. So an executive order originally issued by Mayor de Blasio and renewed by Mayor Adams says that agencies may not categorically exempt emergency procurement from MWBE participation goals, but that doesn't put them in the same category as those contracts for which they are standard and required. We're working on a report that we'll put out next month, but our preliminary estimation is that emergency procurement last year was about 5.2% of the value of last year's emergency procurement was MWBE contracts. That's about a third of the 15% that we hit in the standard procurement methods where MWBE is required. Now, Mike Garner and the team are working hard at it. They really are. I see them. They're working hard at it. They are trying hard. But obviously, when you make exemptions, when you don't require the same level of goal or participation setting, you're going to wind up with lower numbers on average. So the City Charter and Procurement Policy Board rules allow agencies to enter into contracts quickly to meet the needs of an emergency, but they don't absolve agencies of the responsibility to select vendors carefully, to contend to cost considerations, and to perform vendor oversight. One thing that we did earlier this year was an audit of COVID emergency contracting of both vaccinations and testing, and we found wildly ranging costs, no surprise. And after that, we issued a guidance memo, a best practices memo, for ways that agencies can maximize competition amongst vendors. And I'll give you a few examples of where we think they could be doing better on that. So for example, the city has 5 separate staffing contracts for the asylum seeker situation. But we don't know, we can't tell, are they comparing the prices of individual staffing type positions across those contracts and saying to Garner, here's what DocGo is giving us for this position. And so you saw that in the Gothamist story about laundry. We've talked about it around security. A question we've asked is, when the state started providing state troopers, did that mean that vendors were directed to provide less paid security, or are we just doubling the amount of security that we have on a site? So, what we did in order to try, well, I guess let me just give a couple of bits of data here, and you have this all in your, clarify a couple of things first. So, last year on July 29th, 2022, the administration had requested, and we granted this blanket prior approval to use emergency procurement for one or more housing facility to provide shelter for asylum seekers, as well as to create the Asylum Seeker Service Referral Center. Since then, the administration has relied on that blanket approval for now approaching 200 contracts. I guess I heard them say 204. We've given you the numbers that we have as of July 31st, which are that we had received in our office 71 contracts. We see in Passport in total 194. So that's 123 more that haven't made their way to our office and therefore have not been yet set up in the financial management system for payment. That authorizes a total of just over $5 billion in potential payments. By far the two largest agencies are Department of Homeless Services and H&H, each at over $2 billion. No surprise there, largely for the shelters. But we identify here in the chart. And if you go on our website, you can actually download the database that's behind this chart that identifies all of these contracts to the fullest extent we possibly can. That's what most of the press are relying on to get in, to dig in, to do the stories on hotel, on laundry that we're using in our cost comparisons as well. I mentioned the multiple staffing contracts. You've talked a lot about, so I won't go further into it because I don't have a lot more to illuminate on hotel prices. One area that I think is interesting that we're looking at a little more on is food contracting. One interesting thing there is the Department of Homeless Services contracts contain standard provisions for subcontractors to provide food. That's the normal way things go at a DHS shelter, and it's the same way that the sanctuary shelters are set up as well. But now the Department of Social Services has a direct contract to provide food at some of these sites as well, and I think that's in response to some of the complaints that have been made, but it's not clear to us how those subcontracts for food and the direct contracts for food are overlapping, and there aren't that many institutional food contracting agencies, so it may be the case that some of the same vendors are being contracted and subcontracted. And again, when you're using multiple agencies and multiple forms of contracting and subcontracting, it gets hard to have the same level of visibility. That's the kind of thing you can find later in an audit, but we need more real-time coordination. We're stepping up to try to provide what we can. This hearing, I think, is helping push some of that as well, but it is a thing that City Hall can do better. You talked a lot about H&H, so I'll skip that part of the testimony, but just to say we did receive this week what we believe is the most recent and up-to-date batch of the H&H contracts. We'll make sure that we update the website if there's any new there that we don't already have there, and we make the contracts available for FOIL both to the public, the press, and the council as folks ask. Let's talk about DocGo for a minute. As you are well aware, one emergency contract that has, for good reason, come under particular scrutiny is HPD's contract with Rapid Reliable Testing NY, LLC, commonly known as DocGo. While DocGo's contract with HPD, well, I guess I'll roll back. They are utilizing the July 29, 2022 blanket prior approval that we understood to be for housing facilities and for that one navigation center for a contract that quite arguably extends beyond what that blanket prior approval spoke to. Some of them are housing facilities, but that blanket prior approval did not speak to anything outside of New York City or to the wider range of things being done there. But they're utilizing that blanket prior approval. They started this contract in May 2023. In June, they approached our office for something pretty unusual what's called a Directive 24 waiver. Normally, you can't get an advance payment on a contract until that contract has been filed and established in the financial management system and is with our office. I think we looked through, we had only gotten Directive 24 waivers requests for 2 other asylum seeker emergency contracts. One was at the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal. They approached us and said, we want to get the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal for a few months. They're telling us if we make essentially a down payment, we can secure it. If not, they're going to have cruise ships keep coming in. And we determined that was a good reason, and we authorized an advance cash payment before the contract had arrived at our office. And then a set of churches and synagogues and religious organizations wanted also to be able to make their facilities available, and we granted the advance payment there. But the DocGo request for this Directive 24 waiver was very contradictory because it simultaneously said the reason that we're selecting this vendor is that they've got significant resources and then at the same time they said we won't be able to do this if you don't give us a $4 million advance. And we don't give that almost ever to our nonprofit organizations. We did not think a publicly traded company that was being touted as having the significant cash position, even though we did not see evidence that they had experience providing these services, was an appropriate use. So this was before any of the things had been in the press. We denied the Directive 24 cash payment waiver in June. There's no such thing as final approval. I know that's a thing that was referred to on the panel. There's prior approval. There's something called written determination, where they send us basically a one-pager with the name of the contract or the amount of the contract and like one sentence on the services being provided, and they did submit that. The contract then arrived in our office just a couple weeks ago in August. Emergency contracts are exempted from registration. So standard contracting, we get the contract, it's got a 30-day clock, we ask our questions back and forth, we register it. Emergency contracts are exempted from registration, so it's not accurate to say that we register it or that we grant final approval. Generally, we receive it and we file it in the financial management system, enabling the agency to make payments, to receive invoices and makes payments. We've done that 70 times already, so 70 times on the contracts that we received, we filed them and established them for payment. In this case, we had many concerns and objections, so we returned the contract to HPD with those questions and objections. We encouraged them to reconsider the contract, but they instead exercised the mayor's authority to move forward with the emergency procurement over our objections. And we acknowledge that the charter empowers the mayor to move forward with emergency procurement over the objections of the controller. And so per a letter that we sent back to HPD this Monday, we have, the right word is not registered. We don't register these contracts. We filed the contract in the financial management system, which will enable HPD to receive and pay invoices, as is the priority, as is the authority of the mayor. For the first time, we also simultaneously launched a real-time audit of that contract. Normally in an audit, you wait till a contract or a program is done and then go back and look at everything. And we've said here, we're gonna launch it simultaneously so that we can review the invoices in real time, see what we're being asked to pay, make sure we believe those services were provided, look at some of these questions about who the subcontractors are, in as real time as we can. This is new for us, and we'll keep you posted as we do it. But we continue to believe there's just little evidence to suggest that DocGo has the expertise to provide the services that is being contracted for. They're a medical services company, not a logistics company, a social services provider, or a legal services provider. And we do continue to have questions about the subcontracting procedures, which were not sufficiently detailed to our office in the submission. And then just finally to conclude, and I really think in many ways this is the most useful part of the hearing, well over a year after the first increase in asylum seekers arriving in New York City, there does remain a clear and demonstrated need for flexibility and urgency as city agencies respond to the continued arrival of thousands of people here each month. Conditions and situations are changing, sometimes for the good, as the TPS situation shows. That means the legal services being provided at the application center will need to shift, so we need the ability to move that quickly. I've actually been there twice, once in June and once just a couple of weeks ago, and was encouraged to see the evolution of services on site that I think will result in a much higher percentage of applications being accepted for asylum and work authorization, which will enable folks to get on their feet and for many of them move out of shelter and save the city significant money. So I both want to praise good work where it has been done and make sure enough flexibility is built into the city's ability to contract to deliver. But after more than a year, we can't call this situation unforeseen. And in light of some of the concerns identified throughout this hearing and in this testimony, my office is currently reviewing whether the blanket prior approval we granted on July 29th, 2022 remains appropriate, or whether agencies should return to seeking prior approval for emergency procurement on an individual contract basis, a process which we utilize with frequency and that we process speedily, and we will certainly keep the council updated on this review. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Comptroller. I just have one quick question. Would the mayor be would he have been unable to proceed with a contract over your objections if the prior approval was not made, or does the charter allow him to just steamroll us?
So if we didn't have a blanket prior approval in place, they come to us for each individual time they want to do it. So that would have meant, presumably, if they entered into that DOTCO contract in May, that either in April or in May, when they knew they wanted to engage DOTCO, they could have come to us for an individual prior approval on that specific contract. And we turn those requests around quickly. The 69 asylum seeker prior approvals are within over 300 prior approvals we've granted this year, and many of them are on individual bases. Some of those are like a DDC, a construction project, where there's the 22 Reed Street. They discovered there was a problem with the vault under the street, and they needed to get a construction contractor on site quickly, and for public safety, they couldn't go through the bidding process. So we turn those around quickly, and we can consider them. But if we decide that it's not an appropriate situation for emergency procurement because it doesn't meet the charter test, they would need to go through a standard procurement process. They can still, so we have the authority to say no to emergency procurement, and if we don't grant the prior approval, they need it from us and from the law department. If they don't get it from both of us, they can't proceed. They could then move as quickly as they can through standard procurement, and they have other procurement methods. You heard about a lot of them as well today. Open RFPs, they could conduct a bid. There's an accelerated procurement even within standard procurement. They can move through those, and we've seen situations. We rejected a Department of Correction prior approval for emergency procurement for, I'm going to get the details wrong, but in that case, they proceeded with a standard procurement and then brought it to our office. In that case, we look up at registration to make sure all the rules were followed. There have been a small handful of contracts, I think it was 0.2% of standard contracts that we did not register. Even in that case, the mayor has an authority to override us if we don't register the contract. I think Medicare Advantage is the only one that has taken place on in the last, since the beginning of the term.
Thank you very much, Mr. Controller. Oh, you do. Sorry, Councilmember Aviles.
Hello, Comptroller. Thank you so much for your work. I was curious, what I have witnessed in many of our sites is also an additional overlay of NYPD sitting in front of sites that have these contractors with full security. Have you looked at or been able to discern how much NYPD resources are going in addition to the security contracts?
No, it's a good, I know the governor authorized state troopers for some of them, that NYPD are provided for some of them. DHS has its own security force in some cases, and there is contracted security as well. Obviously, we want safe and secure sites, but is it possible this would be a good place to review so that at least we're not spending all of those things without attention to what resources are really needed? It seems like a good idea.
I agree. Thank you.
Councilmember Holden.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Let's go to the .go question. You looked at that you felt that .go couldn't deliver on some of their services, that they didn't have a track record, right? That's what you testified?
When we look at, we didn't see evidence. We asked the agency the question on what do you base the determination that they do have sufficient experience, and we did not see a sound answer to those questions.
But did you check any specific allegations against .go that were published? For instance, you know, the administration testified that it was really the subcontractors. They said it wasn't .go. And .go had to vet them. But did you look at, because they were kind of denying that that really happened, a lot of the published reports happened. Did you find anything else?
Well, we were only reviewing the process of procurement. We haven't yet started really looking at services provided under the contract. You know, that will begin as part of our audit. We had identified concerns and weaknesses about subcontracting. One of the things that we said to the agency in our return memo is we don't see clarity on what their procedures are for vetting and ensuring the integrity of their subcontractors. We had actually identified that as a flaw in the subcontract before the Secretary of State then said, here are 2 security subcontractors that don't seem to have licensed their security guards. So it is something that we're concerned about. It's something we'll be looking at as we turn to the audit, but we haven't specifically checked the allegations in the procurement.
But just one follow-up, so you had kind of doubts on this contract to begin with, the emergency contract, in the early days of it. I guess it was May?
It was in June that we didn't, I mean, they entered into it in May. We received that first Directive 24 waiver in June.
All right, so who's responsible then for looking at delivery of the services? Because you said you just looked at the
well, we will, as part of the audit that we're now commencing, begin to do that. I mean, in general with procurement, the procuring agency has the responsibility for oversight throughout the contract. So in this case, HPD has the responsibility for, you know, they'll review each invoice and sign off for payment. We're not generally involved in the invoicing and payment process. So an agency enters into a contract, and then the agency has the responsibility for making sure that the invoices are appropriate, that the services were provided, and for addressing any challenges. We can take a look at that in an audit. The Attorney General or DOI can obviously come in, but the standard responsibility to do it in every case sits with the contracting agency.
I don't know if you heard the beginning of the chairs saying that the not-for-profits were told not to come to this hearing. What's your reaction to that?
The for-profits, the for-profits.
Oh, the for-profits?
For-profits and one nonprofit.
Well, okay, or the for-profits were not to. They were told not to come to the hearing.
To testify by the act.
Testify.
Oh, I mean, generally at a council public hearing, it's my experience
That's part
that
of
the
our- that's
council
part of our
welcomes everyone
duties.
relevant to come and testify.
Right, but that's part of our duties as council members.
Of course.
So what's your reaction to that?
I mean, I don't think it's good to try to prevent people from giving public testimony that helps the council illuminate important issues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Controller.
Thank you very much.
And now I believe we have 3 people from the public. Oh, Councilmember Arola, go ahead.
Nope, one more, just me. Thank you so much. So, in light of everything that you've just said, will your office be more judicious and proactive in auditing city contracts before filing? And will the office increase its vigilance in returning contracts when there are apparent improprieties or inconsistencies?
So let me distinguish between auditing, which is once something's in operation, and the review we do of contracts through the procurement process. Those are just 2 separate divisions. We've got like a set of folks that look at whether the procurement process has been appropriate, whether it's emergency procurement or standard procurement. And then we have auditors who go look at things that are in operation. So on the question particularly of this hearing of emergency procurement, as I said in my testimony, we are considering whether the blanket prior approval that gives the administration the ability to move forward with emergency procurement without seeking it individually on each contract from our office remains appropriate or not, and that's under scrutiny to figure out whether we should have them return to seeking prior approval on an individual contract basis, and we'll report to you soon on what we determine in that process. We have started not just the DocGo audit, but a couple of audits in this space, you know, as the procurement has grown there and as a lot of spending is taking place there. I suspect that we will be, you know, there's no way we could audit. You know, we only have, you know, we have a limited team of auditors. The charter requires us to audit every single city agency, even every one of the 59 community boards, once every 4 years. So we couldn't audit anywhere near all of these contracts, but we are going to work hard to be vigilant on them.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Councilmember Vertical?
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. I asked this question previously, but I didn't get an answer, so I was wondering if maybe you can help us. In terms of the services provided, can you just list the services that are included in the DocGo contract?
Let me follow up and get that answer to you, because there are some, what I remember from my read of the contract a couple of days ago is that there are some that are essentially within the specific scope of services, and there are some that are authorized that could be added to the scope of services by HPD. And I just want to make sure that we get that right. So let me make sure that we get an answer to the chair and to you on this
Yeah,
question.
thank you. I was wondering in terms of costs, how much the specific services cost, because it's a pretty large sum of money, $432 million. So I was just wondering how that's justified, and if you could.
Well, this is one of the questions that we asked and were one of the objections we had on the contract. We didn't see a basis for the $432 million. We weren't clear what that was based on. How much, what are you providing, and how have you determined that $432 million is the right amount of money? And we didn't get an answer.
So is that not in the contract?
The contract.
You did review the contract, right?
I did review the contract. And they sent an answer to the questions that we asked that we can provide you information on as well. But the way that the contract is structured, there's a total dollar amount. Some things have individual prices, like the $170 a night for a hotel room. Some services specifically says DocGo will provide the city under this contract. And then there's other things, for example, legal services that are authorized that the city could seek to have them provide, but that are not specifically required under the scope of services. So let me get you, a more specific set of answers about what are the mandated, what contracts are specific under the services are specifically required under the contract, which ones could be added at HPD's discretion, and as much information as we see in the contract about what the costs are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Controller. Okay, thank you, chairs, and thank you to the Controller. We will now turn to public testimony. For in-person panelists, please come up to the dais once your name has been called, and for virtual panelists, we'll be calling on individuals one by one to testify. We will be limiting public testimony today to 2 minutes each. Please begin once the sergeant has started the timer. First, we will hear from Emily Alexiou, followed by Raul Rivera, and then Christopher Leon Johnson. If you could please come up to the dais, and we'll get started.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. As everyone sitting in this room recognizes and has spoken about today, the city has been in the midst of a year-long humanitarian crisis. The vast majority of New Yorkers stand in support of our current migrants, but there is no denying that this support has come at a huge cost to the city at millions per day. As city leadership has acknowledged, the greatest hope for alleviating the financial burden, including billions already spent, is by obtaining federal money. But while it seems the city has pinned its hopes on obtaining this money, they have not yet ensured any of this spending would ultimately qualify for federal reimbursement. Federal funding comes with federal regulations. Without federally compliant spending, the city will be right back to where they started, with New Yorkers footing the bill. The following steps must be immediately taken to change course and set the city up to benefit from federal funding. 1, the city must immediately begin the process of creating a federally compliant program in which all contracts align with federal reimbursement. Many of the